crisis in Ukraine that you're trying here at the Security Council many times to resolve, don't you think that what's been stalling for the crisis in Middle East is being damaging your effort for the Ukraine-Russia crisis? Means the imbalance that the world see in the West acting in one front compared to the other one.
I completely reject this idea that in any way Britain or our allies are guilty of double standards. I don't think the two situations are analogous at all. In Ukraine, it was an invasion by Russia, plain and simple, with no justification. And if there's, I can't think of a clearer example in my lifetime of one country invading another with no excuse. When we look across to what is happening in Gaza, I absolutely agree that this is a terrible conflict. I want it to end as soon as it possibly can. But the crucial difference between the two, there was no October the 7th in Russia. There was no excuse for Russia to launch this invasion. Whereas, on the other hand, Israel does have a right to self-defense. What happened on October the 7th, when they lost almost 1,400 people from their own country in what was the biggest attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust, the biggest pogrom since the Holocaust, is a totally different situation. So I completely reject this idea that somehow we're guilty of double standards. We aren't. The two situations are not the same. Last question from Sky again.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, if I could follow up on Israel-Palestine, Prime Minister Netanyahu has released a somewhat coherent plan, as he would see it, for the day after. It doesn't seem to chime very much at all with what the Americans or the British or the Europeans want.
Well, I think what we need, once we can get this pause, and I hope this pause in the fighting comes as soon as possible, what we need is for the hostages to be released. We need a new Palestinian Authority mandated government, perhaps a technocratic government. We're going to need a new political horizon for the Palestinian people so they can see the pathway to a two-state solution. But we're going to need those responsible for October the 7th, the Hamas leadership, to leave Gaza, and we're going to need to see the infrastructure of that terror dismantled. I mean, fundamentally, if you think about it from both sides, Israel needs to see that its security is guaranteed. The Palestinian people need to see there is the prospect of a Palestinian state so they can live in dignity. Those two things are the key. And if they're not in a plan, then I don't believe that plan will work. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Please allow me to introduce you to Her Excellency Tanja Fajon, Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign and European Affairs of the Republic of Slovenia. Please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon in the name of my government, Republic of Slovenia. Slovenia is a member of Security Council, and it's very important for us to be today here in United Nations to remind us that there is one country in Security Council that violates the UN Charter and the international law. We are coming from the region, and we stand with Ukraine. We do understand from our history what it means if someone by force tries to take your land away, or by force try to change internationally recognized borders. That is why we strongly stand with Ukraine in their fight for territorial sovereignty and integrity. And we also want to do everything to support any endeavor that is there to end the war and bring to peace to Ukrainians. Thank you.
Can I have this beautiful and smart?
Yeah, thank you.
Better press.
You want
Hi,
to smoke a cigar?
Yeah, I needed it.
How are you? Good. Get some sleep.
Yes. Good afternoon, colleagues. I would like to thank all nations standing by Ukraine physically right now, and I have the honor to deliver a joint press stakeout on a decade since the beginning of Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine and 2 years of Russia's full-scale military invasion of Ukraine. I do it on behalf of the governments of Ukraine, Albania, Andorra, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Canada, Croatia, Cyprus, Czechia, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Japan, Italy, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Marshall Islands, Federal States of Micronesia, Monaco, Montenegro, the Netherlands, New Zealand, North Macedonia, Norway, Palau, Paraguay, Poland, Portugal, Republic of Korea, Republic of Moldova, Romania, San Marino, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, Uruguay, and the European Union. Today we mark a decade since the beginning of Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine on 19th February 2014, which started with its seizure of Crimea, and 2 years since the beginning of Russia's unprovoked, full-scale, and illegal invasion of Ukraine. We reiterate our resolute condemnation of this flagrant violation of international law. We deplore the Russian Federation's failure to implement the UN General Assembly resolutions adopted at its 11th Emergency Special Session. We also refer to the judgment of the International Court of Justice of 31st January 2024 that leaves no doubt that the Russian Federation is in violation of its international legal obligations. We also consider that the ICJ judgment of 2nd February 2024 is an important step towards holding Russia accountable for its violations of international law. We reiterate that the ICJ order on provisional measures of 16 March 2022 obliges Russia to immediately suspend the military operation that it commenced on 24 February 2022 in the territory of Ukraine, remains legally binding and must be implemented by the Russian Federation. We are appalled by Russian forces' attacks striking civilians and civilian infrastructure of Ukraine, which may constitute war crimes. We re-emphasize that indiscriminate attacks are prohibited by international humanitarian law. We also condemn continued military support for Russia's war of aggression, including by Iran, Belarus, and DPRK. We urge all countries not to provide weapons and to restrict exports of all items critical to the military to Russia for its war of aggression against Ukraine. Russia's continued procurement of arms and related material, including ballistic missiles, from DPRK places both in violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. The Russian Federation's actions undermine the credibility of the Security Council and its resolutions, exacerbate regional tensions, and endanger us all. Today we gathered to reaffirm our solidarity with the people of Ukraine, pay tribute to all those who have sacrificed their lives in the defense of the freedom and independence of Ukraine, and express our deepest sympathy and condolences to the families of the victims of the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine. We demand from Russia to complete exchange of prisoners of war, as well as the release of all unlawfully detained persons and the return of all internees and of civilians forcibly transferred or deported, including children. We will continue working on ensuring accountability for serious crimes under international law committed on the territory of Ukraine during the Russian aggression. We reiterate our demand to Russia to stop its war of aggression against Ukraine and to ensure the full, immediate, and unconditional withdrawal of all Russian forces and military equipment from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We remain committed to the vision of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine in line with the principles of the UN Charter. In this regard, we are encouraged by the meeting of national security advisors and foreign policy advisors on the implementation of the peace formula in Davos, where the key principles of achieving the peace for Ukraine were discussed. Representatives of more than 80 states and international organizations took part in this meeting. We express our joint support for inaugural Global Peace Summit. We reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, extending to its territorial waters. I conclude the joint press stakeout, and I would like to again thank everyone for supporting Ukraine in during these 2 years. We are strong, we are united, we are resolved, and we will deliver. Thank you.
Thank you.
This concludes our joint press stakeout. Thank you. Let's proceed to the meetings.
Bravo.
So, yeah, no, I flew it overnight too. You're closer to home now. So I got another flight home tonight. 2 nights on a plane in a row. Ideas for how you do it.
The 9,557th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. There's a point of order. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель, хотел бы сказать несколько слов по порядку ведения заседания.
I wanted to say a few words on a point of order.
Мы с вами находимся в переполненном
We
зале.
are in a room that is full.
Переполнен не только зал,
The room is
но и
not only
список
full,
выступающих
but
не
the
членов Совета
list
Безопасности,
of
которые именуют себя
speakers who are
министрами
not
иностранных
members of
дел
the Security Council who call themselves
европейских
ministers of foreign affairs of European
в
countries.
ЕС за редким исключением нет
European
самостоятельной
Union,
страновой внешней политики.
except for some
Соответственно, нет и
few
министра
exclusions,
иностранных дел.
does not have an independent
А есть чиновники, выдающие себя
foreign
за таковых.
policy. There are no ministers of
Вся
foreign
внешняя
affairs. There are
политика
simply
Евросоюза
officials who
находится в руках Брюсселя,
claim that they are foreign
а
ministers.
Брюссель, в свою очередь, находится
Foreign
в
policy
руках
is in the hands
Вашингтона.
of Brussels, while Brussels is
Ответьте
in
мне
the
на
hands of
риторический вопрос.
Washington. So maybe you can answer a
Какую
rhetorical
добавленную
question. What
стоимость
is the added value?
будут иметь
What is the
будут иметь
added
написанные
value
под копирку
of
выступления этих
statements by
чиновников,
officials that were
кроме возможности
written under
покрасоваться на
dictation,
телеэкранах
other
своих
than an
стран,
opportunity
выражая
to show
безоговорочную
themselves off on
непоколебимую
the television of their
поддержку
countries
своим
while stating their unconditional, unstinting support for their Kiev clients.
В Нью-Йорке есть представитель ЕС.
In New York, we have a representative of the EU with the UN. He could have spoken on behalf of everyone. The EU has a common foreign policy and common security policy. What could you possibly add to that?
Ну, расскажите тогда уж о
Maybe you
поставляемом вами
can tell
оружии
us about
преступному
the
киевскому
weapons
режиму,
that you're
которым
supplying to the
обстреливает не
criminal
военные
Kiev
цели,
regime, which
а
it uses
мирное
not to
гражданское население
target
российских
military
городов.
facilities, but rather peaceful civilians in Russian cities.
А представитель Великобритании пусть нам поведает, как
Representative
его
of
бывший
the
премьер
United
Борис
Kingdom could tell
Джонсон
us
отговорил
maybe how
киевские
his
власти
former Prime
заключить
Minister Boris
уже
Johnson
парафированное в
dissuaded the
апреле
Kiev
22 года
authorities
мирное
to
соглашение с Россией
conclude an
возобновить Киев,
agreement in April
продолжать
2022 that
боевые
had
действия и
already been
обречь на
initialed,
смерть
an agreement
десятки
with
тысяч
Russia,
несчастных
thus
украинцев,
encouraging
брошенных
Kiev to
на фронт в
continue
качестве
fighting and
пушечных
condemning
мяс.
to death tens of thousands of Ukrainians who were then thrown into the
Кстати,
front
где вы
as
все были
cannon
вчера,
fodder.
когда
And
Совет
by the way, where
обсуждал
were all of you
ближневосточное
yesterday when
регулирование
the
и
Council
ситуацию в Газе?
yesterday was discussing the
Где,
Middle
кстати,
Eastern
был
peace
генеральный
process and the
секретарь ООН?
situation in Gaza? Where was the
Хочу
Secretary
напомнить,
General?
что
I
ни
just
одна
want to
из стран
remind
Евросоюза
everyone that not a single
и вообще
European
Запад
Union country,
ни разу не
in fact, not a
выступила с
single Western
инициативой
country, not
создана
a single
хотя бы
time
одного, ни разу
put
хотя бы
forward an
одного заседания
initiative
по
to
Газе,
convene even one, just one meeting on Gaza.
где число жертв
In
гражданского
Gaza, the
населения
number of
в результате вопиющих
victims among the
нарушений
civilian
международного
population
гуманитарного
as a
права
result
со
of
стороны
blatant
Израиля
violations of
за
international
4,5
humanitarian law by
месяца,
Israel over
большинство из
the past
которых
4.5
женщины и
months,
дети,
most of them are
превысило
women and
показатели
children,
любых
has
военных
far
конфликтов
exceeded the
последних.
numbers of military conflicts that have occurred
Это
over the
более
past
чем
few years.
красноречиво говорит
This
о
is
вашем лицемерии
more
и
than
двойных
eloquently
стандартах.
speaks to your hypocrisy and double
Хочу заранее
standards.
предупредить, я
I
не буду
want
слушать
to
ритуальные заклинания
warn you
представителей
in advance that I
европейских
don't intend to listen to
Пусть
the
они
ritual
упражняются в
mantras
своем
of representatives of
красноречии друг перед
European
другом,
states.
засоряя
They can
эфир
practice
своими
their
лицемерными
eloquence in front of each other,
Благодарю.
clogging the airwaves with their
I
hypocritical
take note of
statements.
the statement of the Russian Federation. I would like to warmly welcome the Secretary General, distinguished ministers, and other high-level representatives present in the Security Council chamber. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Croatia, Germany, Lithuania, Luxembourg, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, North Macedonia, Poland, Portugal, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres.
Madam President, Excellencies, the United Nations Charter and international law are our guides to creating a world free from the scourge of war. Yet, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine directly violated both. 2 years on, and a decade since Russia's attempted illegal annexation of Ukraine's autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, the war in Ukraine remains an open wound at the heart of Europe. It is high time for peace, a just peace based on the United Nations Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolutions. Madam President, the Charter is unequivocal. The United Nations is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. International disputes should be settled by peaceful means, and all states shall refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other state. Mechanisms to settle disputes are set out in Chapter 6 of the Charter. They include negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, and resort to regional agencies or arrangements. These must be the tools we use to settle grievances. Madam President, our world is at a chaotic moment. Following the Cold War and then a period of unipolarity, we are now making a turbulent transition to a as yet uncertain multipolar world. Power relations are unclear, creating a sense of instability and impunity. All borders are the result of history. Many communities are divided by those borders. Many people living on one side have strong ethnic, cultural, or other links to communities on the other side. Can we afford to address different interpretations of history which are so widespread around the world through war? We must pay tribute to the wisdom of African leaders and follow their example. Colonial powers, including my own country, divided the continent of Africa with the stroke of a pen as they did in other parts of the world. But post-independence leaders understood that trying to change borders would open a Pandora's box of bloodshed and feed even greater grievances. In my experience, it's extremely difficult for people to agree on the past. What is more important and less difficult is to help them agree on the future. And to agree on the future, international law and the principles set out in the UN Charter, including respect for territorial integrity and the political independence of states, are fundamental. This is why the Russian invasion of Ukraine is such a dangerous precedent. Madam President, in any war, everyone suffers. But the people of Ukraine are suffering appallingly from the war inflicted on them by Russia. Over 10,500 civilian men, women, and children have been killed, though the true figure is likely higher. Damage and destruction of hospitals, schools, health facilities, and civilian infrastructure is frequent and intensifying. 90 education and healthcare facilities were damaged or destroyed in January alone. And amidst the brutal winter, over 380 towns and villages across the country were without electricity early this month, according to the Ukrainian Energy Company. The United Nations has documented widespread and disturbing brutality. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine reported civilians and prisoners tortured and more than 200 cases of sexual violence, mostly, but not only, at the hands of the Russian Federation forces. All perpetrators must be held to account. Many Ukrainians are experiencing the living nightmare of losing their children. All children that have been deported must be reunited with their families. Nearly 4 million Ukrainians have been internally displaced, including almost 1 million children. And over 14.5 million people inside the country need humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian aid programs carried out by the United Nations and our partners, particularly our Ukrainian partners, reached 11 million people last year. That included providing life-saving food, water, healthcare and shelter, as well as working to remove the deadly explosives that litter the Ukrainian landscape. Yet, access to around 1.5 million people is extremely restricted. That must change. Attacks against humanitarians and civilian infrastructure must stop. And I urge donors to fund in full the $3.1 billion appeal to put our Ukrainian humanitarian response plan into practice and so that we can continue our vital work. Madame la Présidente,
Madam President,
la guerre fait également du mal à la
the
population
war
russe.
is also hurting the
Des
people of
milliers de
Russia.
jeunes Russes ont trouvé la
Thousands
mort
of
sur
young
le front.
Russians are dying on the
Les
front
civils
lines.
touchés par les frappes sur les villes
Civilians
russes
hit by
souffrent aussi.
strikes on Russian cities
Le
are also
risque que le conflit
suffering.
s'aggrave
The
et se
danger of the
répand est
conflict
bien réel.
escalating and expanding is
Dans le monde
very
entier,
real. And
la guerre
around the world,
accentue les clivages
the war is
géopolitiques.
deepening
Elle
geopolitical divides.
attise l'instabilité
It
régionale.
is fanning
Elle
regional
réduit l'espace
instability
disponible pour
and
traiter d'autres
shrinking the
problèmes
space
mondiaux
available to
urgents
address other
et elle
urgent
sape les normes
global
et les valeurs
issues.
communes
And it
qui
is
contribuent à
undermining
notre
the shared
sécurité
norms
à
and values
tous.
that make us all safer.
Le conflit a accéléré une
The
flambée de
conflict
prises
accelerated
alimentaires,
the
de chocs
surge in
économiques
food
et une crise
prices,
mondiale du
economic
coût de la
shocks,
vie,
and a global cost
frappant
of
de
living
plein fouet les
crisis,
pays en
hitting
développement qui
developing
sont encore
countries
en train de se
still
relever du
recovering from
Covid-19.
COVID-19 the
En
hardest.
outre, la
In
possibilité que
addition,
cette guerre
the
entraîne un
prospect
accident
of this war
nucléaire glace
resulting
les
in
sangs du
nuclear
monde
accident
entier.
chills
Les
spines
deux
around the
parties au
world.
conflit doivent prendre
Both
toutes les
sides
mesures
to the
possibles
conflict
pour
must
empêcher
take all
cela,
possible measures
et
to
ce, sur
prevent
tous les
that
sites
from
nucléaires
happening
du pays.
at all nuclear sites
L'Agence
across the country.
internationale de l'énergie
The
atomique
International Atomic
continuera de
Energy
soutenir
Agency
ces
will
efforts.
continue to support these
Nous
efforts.
continuerons également à
And we
pousser
will
en
also
faveur de la
keep
liberté
pushing
et de la sûreté de
for
la
freedom and
navigation en
safety
mer
of
Noire
navigation in the Black
et que les
Sea,
denrées alimentaires
and that
les
badly
engrais ukrainiens
needed
et
Ukrainian
russes
and
dont
Russian
le monde
food
a
and
tant besoin
fertilizers
puissent
reach
atteindre le
the global
marché
market
international sans restriction.
without restrictions.
Madame la Présidente, Excellences,
Madam
depuis
President,
l'invasion à grande échelle de
Excellencies,
l'Ukraine par la
since
Russie,
Russia's
nous avons
full-scale
connu 2
invasion
années
of
de
Ukraine,
combat,
we have
2
had
années
2
de
years of
souffrance,
fighting, 2
des années
years of
auxquelles
suffering,
les tensions
2
mondiales ont
years
été
of stoking
attisées
global
et les
tensions
relations
and
internationales mises à
straining
mal.
global relations.
C'en est assez.
Enough.
Le mépris de la charte était à
Scorning
l'origine
the
du
Charter
problème.
has been the
Le
problem.
respecter en est la
Honoring
solution.
it is the solution.
Cela veut dire respecter la
That
souveraineté,
means honoring
l'indépendance,
the
l'unité
sovereignty,
et l'intégrité
independence,
territoriale
unity,
de
and territorial
l'Ukraine
integrity of
dans ses
Ukraine
frontières internationalement
within its
reconnues.
internationally recognized
Il est temps de
borders.
réaffirmer notre
It is
attachement à la
time to
charte
recommit to the
et
Charter
de faire preuve d'un
and
respect
to renew
renouvelé
respect
pour le droit
for international
international.
law.
Telle est la voie de la paix et de
That
la
is the path to
sécurité
peace and
en
security
Ukraine et dans
in
le monde
Ukraine
entier. Et je
and
vous
around the
remercie.
world. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to the members of the Council. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Tanja Fajon, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I would also like to thank the Secretary General for his, as always, lucid, frank and insightful briefing. Madam President, it has been 2 years of death and destruction for Ukraine and its people. 2 years of international humanitarian law violations. 2 years of human rights violations. 2 years of aggression. To add to this grim picture, this week also marks 10 years since the illegal annexation of Crimea. While being aware of repetitiveness, I want to seize the opportunity of sitting in this chamber, representing a UN Security Council member, to condemn once again the Russian aggression against Ukraine in blatant violation of the UN Charter and Helsinki Final Act on inviolability of borders in Europe. Slovenia expresses full support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. While Ukraine has been attacked with artillery shells, drones, and ballistic missiles, the rest of the world has been attacked with narratives, particularly on how this war started and why it was inevitable to start. Let me provide you with our own perspective, a perspective of a country committed to peace and peaceful settlement of international disputes. A perspective from the Security Council member from the region that is being destabilized by the war. My country believes that Russia is displaying a complete disregard for the UN Charter. just as it is displaying a complete disregard for the vast corpus of international law and key agreements that provided for European and international stability and security. It is resulting in lives being lost, families being torn apart, and infrastructure being destroyed. And there is no alternative story that can be told. No compelling additional narrative to be shared, just a story of death and destruction. Regardless of our vicinity, we did not see this war coming. To be more exact, we refused to believe that it was coming, that a major war on our doorstep was possible, a war which would so blatantly violate borders of a sovereign state, destabilizing the whole region and changing the global geopolitical landscape. Yet 2 years into this senseless war, we are not accepting it and are most definitely not accepting the demands of the occupying Russian forces. We are not tired of calling this aggression out and of demanding it to stop. We will spare no effort in pursuing full accountability for the long list of atrocities and other international crimes. Madam President, Slovenia applauds the Ukrainian nation for its bravery and resolute defense of their motherland. We share their vision of a just, lasting, and sustainable peace, and we join in the collective efforts in this regard. Such peace is worth believing in and acting on, and we will continue to stand by Ukraine until we reach that point. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Fajon, for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Stéphane Séjourné, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France.
Merci Madame la Présidente, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Distinguished Secretary General. For 2 years now, Russia has carried out a large-scale war of aggression against Ukraine and against the Ukrainian people. This is an unjust, unjustifiable, and illegal war of aggression.
Au total, cela fait 10
it has now
mois, 10
been
ans que
10
la
years
Russie cherche à
that
envahir
Russia
son
has
voisin
sought to invade its neighbor
veut lui prendre une partie de
and
son
to
territoire.
take a part of
Ni
its
les
territory
mauvais
from
prétextes
that
déployés par la
neighbor.
Russie, ni
Neither
la
the poor
propagande
pretext
et la
used by
désinformation
Russia,
massive
nor
sur
the
les réseaux
propaganda or
sociaux
the
ne
massive
résistent à ce
misinformation on
constat
social
clair et
networks
sans appel.
can
La
deny
Russie
this
continue d'agresser
obvious
son
and
voisin,
crystal
des
clear
troupes
fact.
russes
Russia
sont
continues
présentes
to
sur le
attack its
territoire
neighbor. There are
ukrainien.
Russian troops on
L'État
Ukrainian
souverain,
territory.
l'Ukraine, un
A
État souverain.
sovereign state. Ukraine is a
La
sovereign
Russie a
state.
fait seule le choix de la guerre
Russia
qu'elle a
alone
décidé de mener
has
depuis
opted for
2
war,
ans,
a war that it
dont
has been
elle
carrying
porte
out for
seule
2
la
years,
responsabilité.
and Russia alone
La
bears
Russie
the
pourrait
responsibility.
choisir d'y mettre
Russia
un terme en
could
retirant ses
decide
troupes du
to
territoire
end
ukrainien,
that war by
mais elle
withdrawing
ne le
its
fait pas.
troops from Ukrainian
Au
territory, but it
contraire,
does
elle
not do
continue
that.
de
On the
mener une
contrary,
guerre
it
dont les
continues to
conséquences
carry out this war
font souffrir beaucoup de
whose
populations,
consequences
nos
have
populations,
caused suffering
celles
for many people,
des
for
pays
our
les plus
people.
vulnérables, celles
I'm thinking
qui
of the
souffrent
most
le
vulnerable
plus de la crise alimentaire,
countries
de la crise
which
énergétique
suffer
également.
most from the
Cette
food and
guerre,
energy
je le disais,
crisis.
elle est illégale et
This war
en tout point
is
contraire à
illegal
la Charte
and
des
it
Nations
runs
Unies,
counter to the
aux
UN
règles et
Charter,
aux principes qui
to
fondent
the
l'ordre
rules and
international
principles
que nous avons
underpinning
bâti au
international
sortir
order
de
which
la Deuxième
we
Guerre mondiale.
built
Un
after
ordre
the Second
dont
World
notre
War.
Conseil doit rester d'ailleurs le garant,
Our
comme
Council
le
must
respect de
continue
sa
to
souveraineté
uphold this
également,
order
de l'indépendance et de l'intégrité
and
territoriale
ensure
des
respect
États.
for the sovereignty, independence,
Nous ne pouvons
territorial
pas, nous
integrity
ne
of
devons
states.
pas
We
y
cannot,
renoncer.
we must
Nous
not
devons
shirk
faire
that duty.
primer et
We must
respecter le
ensure
droit.
that law
Je vous
prevails
remercie
and
d'ailleurs,
is
Monsieur le
respectable.
Secrétaire
And thank you
général,
very
de
much,
rappeler
Distinguished
très
Secretary
clairement
General, for
ces
reminding us
principes dans votre
quite
intervention.
clearly about those
La Russie
principles in your
viole
statement.
les principes de la Charte,
Russia
mais
is
aussi
violating the principles
les
of the Charter,
résolutions
but
adoptées
also
par notre
resolutions
Conseil.
adopted by our
Elle
Council.
utilise aussi
It
pour
does so
mener ses frappes des drones
in order
acquis
to
en
carry
Iran
out
et des missiles
strikes. It
fournis
has
par la Corée du
purchased
Nord.
drones
Elle
from
occupe
Iran,
illégalement
missiles
la
from North
centrale
Korea. It is
de nucléaire
illegally
de
occupying
Zaporizhia
the Zaporizhia
et
nuclear
n'hésite
power
pas à miner
plant, and it
ses
does not
abords.
hesitate to mine the
Cela
surrounding
accroît de
area.
manière irresponsable d'ailleurs
And this
le
has
risque
led
d'incidents et d'accidents nucléaires.
irresponsibly led to an increased risk of a nuclear accident. It also impedes the free circulation
et de coercition, elle emploie la désinformation.
In the Black Sea,
et là, Monsieur le représentant
war
de la
of
Fédération
Russia
de Russie,
is
je ne peux pas
illegal.
vous laisser dire que les ministres ne se sont pas
I
réunis
will not allow you to
sur Gaza.
say
J'ai
that
moi-même
ministers
présidé au
do
niveau
not
ministériel
stand together
une
with regard to
réunion
Gaza. I
hebdomadaire
myself
sur
held
ce point-là, en
a
présence
weekly meeting
de nombreux
on
ministres
that
de
matter
l'Union
in the
européenne.
presence of many European ministers.
La guerre de la Russie est illégale
Russia's
aussi
war is
parce
also
que ces
illegal
troupes
because
violent
its
massivement le
troops
droit
are
international
committing massive
humanitaire
violations of international
et les droits de
humanitarian
l'homme.
law
Illégale, la
and human
guerre
rights
russe
law.
l'est aussi
The Russian war
inhumaine.
is illegal
Je veux
as well because
redire
it is
ici
cruel,
notre
inhuman.
condamnation la
And
plus
again, I
ferme
repeat our
au
firmest
massacre de
condemnation for
des
the
viols,
massacre of civilians, the rapes and the
comme
torture
armes de guerre,
used as
des
weapons of war,
déportations d'enfants
as well as the
ukrainiens.
deportation of
Ces
Ukrainian
crimes
children.
ne doivent pas rester
These
impunis.
crimes must
C'est
not go
d'ailleurs
unpunished.
tout le sens des
And that
deux mandats d'arrêt
ultimately
émis
is
par la
the
Cour
thrust
pénale
of the
internationale
two
l'an
arrest
dernier.
warrants
Tout
issued
cela,
by the ICC
la
last
Russie
year.
veut le faire aussi oublier.
And Russia would like us
Elle
to
veut
forget
nous
that as
persuader
well.
de ses victoires
It wants to persuade
inéluctables
us of
et elle
its
veut que
victories,
nous renoncions
and it
à
wants
défendre
us
notre sécurité et nos
to
valeurs.
stop
Elle échouera sur
standing
ce terrain et
for
sur
and
d'autres.
upholding our
D'abord,
security,
la Russie
security
est en échec sur le point militaire
in
et sur le point de
Ukraine,
vue
but
militaire.
Russia is
Après
failing
2
on the
ans de
military and
pertes
political front after
immenses
2 years
au
of
prix
enormous
de pertes
losses,
humaines par centaines de
enormous
milliers,
human
au prix d'une
losses,
répression interne sans merci contre les
relentless
voix qui
domestic
disent
repression
l'absurdité de cette
against
guerre,
people
au
who
prix
say
d'une
how
économie en
absurd
déclin
this war
malgré des
is,
statistiques faussées.
and a failing
Elle
economy
stagne
despite
sur le
the trumped
terrain
up
militaire et recule
statistics.
en mer Noire.
And
Elle échouera aussi
it
à
will
nous
also
décourager. Dès
fail
lundi, la
to
France
discourage
réunira
us.
autour du président de la
France will
République
meet with the President of
les
the
pays
Republic
déterminés à
and
accroître
countries
le soutien
determined
à
to
l'Ukraine
increase
et à
support to
répondre à la
Ukraine
menace que la
and
Russie
to
fait
respond
peser sur leur
to
sécurité.
Russia's threat to that
Solidarité,
country's
nous
security.
sommes donc
We
pleinement
stand together
mobilisés
and
pour
we are fully
l'Ukraine. L'Ukraine
mobilized
exerce sa
in support
légitime
of
défense.
Ukraine,
Elle
which is
défend
calling for its
son
legitimate
existence
defense,
même et
is
sa
fighting for its
liberté,
very survival,
notamment face
for its freedom
à l'envahisseur.
vis-à-vis the
Et pourtant,
invader,
l'Ukraine
and
seule
yet
cherche
Ukraine
la paix
alone is seeking
et propose
peace.
des initiatives
It
en
has
ce sens avec
proposed
le plan du
initiatives
président
to that
Zelensky.
end, along
La
with
France et
President
l'Europe
Zelensky's
continueront
plan. France and Europe
unis
will continue
à
to stand
soutenir là
united
aussi ce
and
plan
to
de soutien
support
et de ce plan
that
de paix
plan of
que
peace,
propose le
that plan
président
of support
Zelensky. Voilà,
proposed
Monsieur
by
le
President
Secrétaire
Zelensky.
général, Madame la
Distinguished
Présidente,
Secretary
notre
General,
Conseil
Madam
doit
President,
être
our
uni
Council
autour
must
d'un
stand
objectif
united
que notre
with one
charte
goal in
s'impose
mind.
partout, à tous.
Under our charter,
Dans cette guerre, c'est la victoire de notre charte
the
qu'il faut
victory of our
rechercher
charter
par
in the
la
face
mise
of
en
this
échec
war
de la Russie. Je vous
is
remercie.
what we must stand for. Thank you.
His Excellency, Mr. Séjourné, for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Lord David Cameron, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President and Mr. Secretary General. We meet 2 years since Vladimir Putin ordered a wholly unprovoked invasion of a sovereign member of the United Nations. Airstrikes at dawn, tanks rolling across the border, preposterous claims that this was not a declaration of war. And in many ways, the most remarkable thing was the total lack of any justification whatsoever, or of any threat from Ukraine. The abject disregard for the laws that bind nations and for the principles of this United Nations. The brazenness with which Putin still claimed this was somehow legitimate. Days after February the 24th, the United Nations General Assembly declared that the invasion was wrong and that Russia must withdraw immediately. 2 years on, this has not changed. And so today I want to pose 2 questions. My first to the Kremlin. My first visit as Foreign Secretary was to Ukraine. I stood in the wreckage of Odessa's bombed-out cathedral. I saw brave Ukrainians kissing loved ones goodbye as they left to defend their homeland. And I know that such scenes are not limited to Ukraine. Russian mothers, too, have had to bid farewell to Russian sons. Russian cities, too, now bear the scars of war. So my question to Putin is simple. Why? His government claims this to be a battle between brothers. What twisted form of brotherhood is this for which so many lives must be ruined. How is Russia living up to its responsibilities as a permanent member of this Council to uphold international peace and security? And how many ridiculous explanations have we now had for this invasion? Are they criminals or are they fellow Russians? One minute Ukraine is an existential threat, the next we're told it doesn't exist. Are you fighting stooges of NATO or Nazis? The only people behaving like Nazis are the Putin regime, invading another country and hoping the world will be weak and let you get away with it. That is the simple truth. Putin believes he can take territories, redraw borders, exercise force to build his empire, and we must not let this stand. We know Ukraine's answer. We saw the courage of President Zelensky 2 years ago. And I say to the permanent representative of the Russian Federation, he is quite capable, and the Ukrainian people are quite capable of making up their own mind about whether they should surrender part of their country to your illegal invasion. And today we admire the perseverance of the Ukrainian people day in, day out. They won't falter. Indeed, they're continuing to push Russia back, liberating half the land Putin seized and driving the Russian Navy out of its base in Sevastopol. The course of the war may ebb and flow, but the seizure of a small town does not change the reality of Russia's situation. The Russian military is being drained of its modern equipment. You're having to rely on poor quality shells from Pyongyang. And you sent a generation of Russian boys into the meat grinder. What do you tell their mothers they died for? Or don't you even bother? The Kremlin expected Ukraine to fold, but they are standing firm for their freedom. And you should all know Britain's answer as well. Last month, the Prime Minister was the first foreign leader to address the Rada. We are the first country to have signed a security pact with Ukraine. And yesterday we imposed further sanctions, clamping down on Russia's military-industrial complex and those enablers seeking to keep it running. These sanctions are a reminder. We won't falter. We will stand firm for Ukraine's freedom. And the world has also seen Alexei Navalny's answer. He showed incredible courage in returning to Russia. He didn't falter, and he has now suffered terrible consequences for standing firm for Russian democracy. And today is an opportunity, Secretary General, to give the world's answer. All of us abhor needless suffering. None of us have escaped the economic consequences of the war. And yet we all know what is at stake here. In acting so brazenly, Putin is not only trying to seize a chunk of his neighbor's territory, he is not only trying to extinguish the Ukrainian people's right to self-determination, he is openly trying to upset the international order, replacing it not with some progressive vision of equality of nations, but with a return to a 19th century ideology where might, particularly his might, is right. That is why we must all stand up to Putin, not just out of sympathy to Ukraine, but because his actions in Ukraine are so dangerous for everyone else. If we give in to the idea that one country can invade another with impunity, then we will be left in a dreadful situation where any country could face a similar fate. Respect for sovereignty lies at the heart of the international system, at the heart of the United Nations. Nothing matters more to its members than having our borders treated as inviolable. And that's why nothing should matter more to us than seeing Putin fail. We must not falter. We must stand firm. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Lord Cameron for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ignacio Cassis, Federal Councillor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President.
Notre organisation a été fondée sur
Our
la recherche
organization
de la
was
paix.
founded on the pursuit of
La paix
peace.
est notre raison d'être.
Peace is our raison d'être.
Monsieur le Secrétaire général,
Distinguished
permettez-moi
Secretary
d'utiliser
General,
aujourd'hui les mots
allow
que
me today to
vous
use
avez
the words
prononcés
which you
au
spoke
début du mois devant
earlier
l'Assemblée
this
générale
month
des
to
Nations
the
Unies.
UN General Assembly.
La paix est notre raison
Peace
d'être.
is our raison d'être.
La Suisse partage profondément cette vision.
Switzerland wholeheartedly
Le slogan
shares
de
this
notre
vision.
candidature au Conseil de
The
sécurité
slogan of
résonne
our
ainsi:
candidacy for the Security Council thus
un
resonates.
plus pour la paix,
Un plus pour
a
la
plus
paix.
for peace.
A plus for peace.
Ce plus symbolise également la croix blanche
also
au
symbolizes
cœur de
the
notre
white
drapeau
cross
rouge,
at the heart of our red
incarnant
flag,
notre engagement constant
embodying our constant
envers la
commitment
construction et le
to
maintien de la paix
building
dans le
and
monde.
maintaining peace in the world.
Chers collègues,
Dear colleagues,
malheureusement, au cours des 2 dernières années,
over the past
le
2
Conseil de
years,
sécurité n'a pas pleinement
the
assumé
Security
sa
Council has
responsabilité
not fully assumed
dans
its
la garantie de la paix et de la
responsibility
sécurité
to
pour
guarantee
l'Ukraine
peace and
et son
security
peuple.
for Ukraine and its people.
Nous avons, bien sûr,
Of course,
incessamment
we
lancé
have
des appels
tirelessly
à la paix,
called for peace,
à respecter le droit humanitaire international
for respect
et à
of
redoubler
international
d'efforts pour mettre fin à
humanitarian
ce
law,
conflit.
and we have redoubled efforts
Et
to put an end
aujourd'hui,
to this conflict. And today,
Aujourd'hui, les pertes humaines se chiffrent par
the
milliers.
loss of life runs
Les
into the
personnes
thousands,
déplacées se comptent par
the
millions.
displaced number in the millions,
Et les familles déchirées
and the
ne se
families
comptent plus.
torn apart are countless.
Les répercussions, tant en Europe
The
que dans le monde,
repercussions both in
sont
Europe
désormais
and worldwide
évidentes
are
sur
now obvious
les plans alimentaires,
in terms of
énergétiques,
food,
sécuritaires et ainsi de
energy,
suite.
security, and so on.
Alors, chers collègues,
And so,
que
dear
pouvons-nous
colleagues,
faire?
what can we do?
Et surtout, que faisons-nous
And above all, what
Que
do we
faisons-nous
do? What are we
pour que la
doing
Charte des Nations Unies
to ensure
soit respectée?
that the UN Charter is respected?
Que faisons-nous pour que les
What are
conventions
we
de
doing
Genève
to
cessent
ensure
d'être
that the
violées?
Geneva Conventions are no longer violated?
Que faisons-nous pour que
What are
l'humanité
we
dans la
doing
guerre
to ensure that
soit assurée
humanity in
et
war
pour
is
que la paix
assured
soit rétablie?
and that peace will be
Une
restored?
chose est certaine,
One thing is
malgré,
certain.
malgré toute la
Despite
frustration engendrée par cette
all
guerre,
the frustration caused by
voire
this
par
war,
toutes les guerres,
indeed
nous ne
by
devons
all
pas
wars,
céder au pessimisme.
we must not give in to pessimism.
Nous devons plutôt analyser et agir en
Instead,
fonction des
we need
faits
to analyze and
pour
act
trouver
on the
tout
facts
chemin menant vers la
to
paix.
find any path to peace.
À la lumière de notre histoire de
In the light of
Nations
our history
Unies.
as United Nations.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam
Excellence,
President,
dans cette
Excellencies,
salle,
in this room,
nous sommes les gardiens de la paix.
We
Nous
are the
portons
guardians
ensemble
of
la
peace.
responsabilité de cet idéal.
and therefore together
décidé
we
il y a
bear the
3/4 de siècle.
responsibility for this ideal decided
Nous
three-quarters of a
devons
century
parvenir
ago.
à faire ensemble
We must
un premier
succeed
pas sur ce
in
chemin.
taking the first step on
Car
this
la
path
cause de la paix
together,
est trop grande
because the
pour
cause of
permettre à
peace
nos
is too
différences
great
de nous bloquer.
to allow our differences to hold us back.
En janvier dernier, au marge
Last
du World Economic
January, on
Forum
the
de Davos en
sidelines of the
Suisse,
World Economic Forum
et à
in
la
Davos,
demande de
Switzerland,
l'Ukraine,
and at Ukraine's
la Suisse a
request,
exprimé son engagement à
Switzerland
organiser une
expressed its commitment
conférence de haut niveau
to
sur la paix en
organizing
Ukraine.
a high-level conference on peace in Ukraine.
Nous sommes parfaitement conscients de la
We are
complexité de
fully
cette
aware of the
mission,
complexity of this mission,
de la sinuosité du parcours
the sinuosity of the
l'incertitude
path,
de
and the
l'horizon.
uncertainty of the horizon.
Mais nous travaillons sans relâche
But
pour
we are
initier une
working
dynamique à la
tirelessly
fois
to create a
pragmatique
dynamic
et inclusive.
that is both pragmatic and
Je
inclusive.
suis en effet convaincu qu'il faut écouter
Indeed, I'm
tout le
convinced
monde,
that we need to listen to
comprendre les
everyone
grammaires de la paix
to
des uns
understand each
et
other's
des autres.
grammar of peace.
Et l'horizon incertain deviendra de
And
plus
the
en plus
uncertain
certain
horizon will become more and
grâce à
more
une large
certain
alliance de toutes les
thanks
régions
to
du
a
monde.
broad alliance of all regions of the world.
Et les parcours sinueux
And the winding
deviendront
road
moins sinueux
will become less
si nous
winding
évitons les pièges de la
if we avoid
rhétorique
the
qui
pitfalls
alimente les
of the
oppositions.
rhetoric that fuels opposition.
Mesdames et messieurs, je
Ladies
vous
and
invite à
gentlemen,
entreprendre ce
I
premier pas,
invite you to take that first
à
step,
nous lever
to stand up
aujourd'hui
today
pour marcher ensemble
and
vers
to
la
walk together towards
paix.
peace.
Bien sûr, la
Of
Suisse
course,
n'est ni la première
Switzerland
ni la
is
seule
neither
à
the
vouloir
first
agir.
nor the only country to
D'autres
take
pays se sont
action.
également engagés
Other
et je
countries
salue ici
are
leurs
also
initiatives.
committed, and I welcome their
Mais le temps
initiatives.
nous est compté.
But time is running out.
Unissons nos forces pour démarrer
Let's
un
join
processus
forces
avant l'été.
to start a process
La
before
Suisse
the
est prête
summer.
à y mettre toute
Switzerland is
son énergie.
prepared to put all its
Même
energy
si la
into
demande
it.
vient d'une seule partie,
Even if the
l'Ukraine,
request comes
et
from
alors
only
que mon
one
pays
party,
condamne
Ukraine, and
l'agression
while my
militaire
country
russe,
condemns Russian military
c'est
aggression,
aujourd'hui notre effort collectif
it is our
qui
collective
est demandé.
effort that is being called
La
upon
paix
today.
est dans cette salle
Peace
notre
in this
raison d'être.
room is our raison
Une
d'être.
conférence de haut niveau sur la paix
A
en
high-level
Ukraine
conference
est un
on peace in
premier
Ukraine
pas,
is a first step,
insuffisant
insufficient on
à
its
lui
own,
seul, mais indispensable pour
indispensable
commencer.
as a starting point.
D'autres nations pourront également prendre la relève
I'm sure other nations will be able to follow
Il
suit.
s'agit maintenant de commencer avec
Now we need to
pragmatisme,
start with
avec
pragmatism
réalisme.
and with realism.
Pragmatisme pour trouver le dénominateur
to find
commun
the common denominator
de nos nations.
for our nations.
Réalisme pour trouver le moyen d'embarquer à terme
of
l'Ukraine
eventually
et la Russie
bringing
sur ce
Ukraine
chemin.
and Russia on board.
Pour préparer la paix demain,
To prepare for
j'espère
peace
pouvoir
tomorrow,
compter
I hope
sur
I can
vous
count on you
aujourd'hui.
today.
Notre raison
Our
d'être
raison
en
d'être
dépend.
depends
Je
on
vous
it.
remercie.
I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Cassis for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Cho Tae-yul, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea.
Madam President, I wish to thank Guyana for convening this meeting. I also extend my appreciation to Secretary General Guterres for his insightful yet sadly troubling briefing. Indeed, it feels almost surreal to be in the very chamber which bears primary responsibility for international peace and security to address the unlawful aggression of one of its permanent members. 2 years since Russian tanks crossed over into Ukraine, violating the most sacrosanct tenet of the UN Charter, we see no signs of Russia's unlawful actions abating. Sadly, we see a humanitarian disaster unfolding. The conflict is claiming the lives of tens of thousands of civilians, upending livelihoods and inflicting long-lasting trauma, especially on children. A generation of young Ukrainians and Russians are perishing because of an ill-begotten war. Russia's war against Ukraine not only tears away at the fabric of the United Nations, it has shattered the sense of security, not just for the people of Ukraine, but also for its neighbors. The impact of the war has also been reverberating around the world, disrupting energy supplies and food security, exacerbating economic and social crises in other parts of the world. The flagrant violation of international norms and obligations, denying Ukrainian independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity must cease immediately. International humanitarian law, which clearly prohibits attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, must be adhered to at all times and by all parties. As a nation that knows all too well what it means to suffer from military aggression, Korea firmly believes that aggression must not go unanswered. As a nation all too familiar with the agonizing consequences of armed conflict, Korea has a profound sense of empathy with the plight of the Ukrainian people. That is why President Yoon Suk-yeol visited Ukraine last July and launched the Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative. Under this initiative, Korea has provided $140 million in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, including demining equipment and emergency medical vehicles. Starting this year, we will provide a comprehensive aid package of $2.3 billion spread out over several years to help the Ukrainian people alleviate their suffering and rebuild their nation. We are also collaborating with international partners through the multi-agency donor coordination platform for Ukraine to ensure that our collective assistance is both effective and well coordinated. Madam President, my government is deeply troubled by the emerging military cooperation between Russia and North Korea. North Korean munitions and missiles have been sighted in Ukraine, which not only aggravates the human suffering, but also risks further escalating and prolonging the war in Ukraine. If and when it turns out to be the case that North Korea receives in return whether advanced military technology or oil shipments exceeding limits under Security Council resolutions, this would redound to North Korea's ability to threaten security on the Korean Peninsula and beyond. Both dimensions of this nexus constitute unequivocal violations of multiple UN Security Council resolutions and undermine the global non-proliferation regime. We strongly urge Russia and North Korea to comply with the relevant Security Council resolutions, all of which were unanimously adopted in this chamber. Madam President, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is heightening geopolitical tensions worldwide, presenting us with challenges of unprecedented magnitude. Therefore, it is imperative that the Security Council devise effective strategies to navigate these complexities, notwithstanding inherent shortcomings and current constraints, to fulfill its fundamental duty of maintaining international peace and security. and I wish to reaffirm Korea's commitment as a member of the Security Council to actively contribute to realizing this goal. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Tayul for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Linda Thomas Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States and member of President Biden's cabinet.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Secretary General Guterres, for your briefing, and thank you to Guyana for calling this important meeting. I welcome the many foreign ministers joining us today. Your presence reflects the importance that we accord this issue. 2 years ago, on a cold February evening, I gathered with many of you in this chamber. The United States and Albania had called a late-night emergency meeting because we feared Russia's invasion of Ukraine was imminent, and we were right. We'd been sounding the alarm for weeks. I had informed the Council in no uncertain terms about the buildup of troops along the border with Ukraine. Secretary Blinken had come to the Security Council laying out in exacting detail our concerns that Russia would soon invade its sovereign neighbor. And then on February 24th, it did. While I and other members of this council called for diplomacy and de-escalation, President Putin openly chose war. Even as the Russian representative who was sitting in the president's chair denied it in this room, we could see the reality of Russia's brutal aggression unfolding in real time. The world could see that choice between violence and diplomacy, war and peace, unfolding in real time. Today, despite Putin's best efforts, the world continues to bear witness to Russian brutality, Russian hypocrisy, and Russian cruelty. Thanks to the unrelenting work of Ukrainian investigators and aid workers, fearless journalists, and numerous UN bodies, including this council, we have seen through the Kremlin lies. The lie that it was not Russian troops who illegally seized Crimea 10 years ago, a falsehood that when it suited him, Putin eventually admitted to. The lie that the transnational criminal organization of Wagner Group had no affiliation with the Kremlin. Of course, the widespread deployment of Wagner forces, as well as Putin's own admission that the Kremlin financed their work, proved otherwise. And of course, the lie that in the months leading up to Russia's invasion 2 years ago, Russia had no intention to further invade Ukraine, that the nearly 200,000 troops it assembled near the border were simply a military exercise. Through these lies, Putin has tried to rewrite history, to justify the unjustifiable, to break the will of the Ukrainian people and to break the will of the international community as we stand up for the United Nations Charter and its foundational principles of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Colleagues, we cannot let that happen. Not when Russia continues to bomb grain silos, last destroying more than 300,000 tons of grain in a matter of months last year. Not when the Kremlin continues to detain political activists, journalists, opposition leaders, people like Alexei Navalny, who was killed for speaking truth to power about the authoritarian rot at the heart of Russia's government. Not when Russian forces have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine, including summary executions, torture, and sexual violence. And not when hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been deported to Russia or forcibly transferred within Russia-occupied territories of Ukraine. Babies as young as a few months old, whose Ukrainian identities Russia has stripped and whose futures they have permanently changed. The list of Russian violations and abuses could, unfortunately, go on and on. This senseless war has worsened a global food insecurity crisis, roiled the global energy market, caused incalculable damages to our environment, and undermined the global nonproliferation regime. For 2 years, President Putin has been hell-bent on beating Ukrainians into submission. And yet, in the face of so much cruelty, so much trauma, so much death and destruction, the Ukrainian people have not been cowed. they have fought back, and they've done so effectively. Vastly outnumbered, they have not only defended their land, but their freedoms, their democracy, and their identity. And they have shown the world that community is a form of resistance. I think about the people setting up makeshift schools and bomb shelters, the medical professionals nursing orphans back to health, and then hiding these babies from Russians hoping to take them. The workers I met at a grain processing facility in Kyiv, people who risked their lives to feed the hungriest among us. For 2 years, Ukrainians have stopped Putin's quest to conquer their country, strip it of its independence, and absorb it into Russia, and while fighting to keep the world fed and warm. And so as a global community, we must support Ukraine to help Ukraine fight not only for peace, but for a just, lasting peace, rooted in the UN's Charter's fundamental principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence, a peace that, time and time again, Russia has rejected in favor of violence, destruction, and unlawfulness. Because let's be exceedingly clear here. If Russia puts down its weapons today, the war would end. If Ukraine put down its weapons, Ukraine would be over. Only one party is the aggressor in this war, and only one party can end it. That was true 2 years ago when this body gathered on that cold February night as the world turned upside down, and it's true today. So amidst so many bald-faced lies hurled at us from this chamber and from Moscow, we continue to stand with the people of Ukraine. And we continue to demand that Russia put an end to its campaign of cruelty, that it withdraw its troops from Ukraine's internationally recognized border and return the children taken from their homes, that it cease its unlawful procurement of ballistic missiles, launchers, and other arms from DPRK in violation of Security Council resolutions, and that it meets its responsibility as a member of this council and uphold the charter we have all sworn to protect. Today, President Biden announced new sanctions against Russia for its ongoing war of aggression in Ukraine and for the death of Alexei Navalny. We need to hold Russia accountable so that we need not mark any more tragic milestones like this one today, so that the brave, resilient people of Ukraine can finally see a just and lasting peace. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Thomas Greenfield, for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Tsuji Kyoto, State Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing. 2 years ago, Russia started its brutal aggression against Ukraine. And I join you today to strongly condemn Russia for continuing this aggression and hostility right up to the present day. Madam President, we condemn in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. This blatant violation of international law, including the UN Charter, cannot be justified. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine must be respected. This is not only a European issue, nor just an issue of the so-called Russia and the West. Any attempt to unilaterally change the status quo by force must not be tolerated anywhere in the world. Many civilians have lost their lives or been injured, and Russia's attacks on hospitals, schools, power plants, and other critical infrastructure are not just destroying the present lives of the Ukrainian people, but also threatening their future. International law, including international humanitarian law, must be upheld. All perpetrators of this atrocity must be held accountable. Russia's procurement of ballistic missiles from North Korea and their use against Ukraine is absolutely unacceptable. Any transfer of weapons or related equipment and technology, low quality, by the way, if I may add, between Russia and North Korea is a clear violation of relevant Security Council resolutions. And we're also deeply concerned about any possible transfer of nuclear and ballistic missile-related technology to North Korea. Russia's threat to use nuclear weapons is a serious and unacceptable menace to the peace and security of the international community. Madam President, we respect the efforts of many countries to seek peace. However, it is inappropriate to equate the aggressor and the victim, and to demand diplomatic efforts on both sides as if both sides are at fault. Japan reiterates that peace must be based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. In this regard, Japan supports President Zelensky's efforts to his peace formula. We must achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, which the overwhelming majority of the General Assembly and the Security Council has been calling for. We must uphold the international order based on the rule of law. Madam President, since my visit to Kyiv last November, I've been working hard to materialize the recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine. And on February 19th, Japan invited Prime Minister Shmyhal to Tokyo for the Japan-Ukraine Conference for promotion of economic growth and reconstruction. At the conference, we confirmed our intention to promote close public-private cooperation and agreed on the importance of medium to long-term support with consideration to women and children. Our public and private sectors will further support Ukraine, taking into account the country's needs. Madam President, we once again strongly urge Russia to cease its aggression and withdraw immediately and unconditionally from all internationally recognized territories of Ukraine. This, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, is a matter of principle. It is beyond politics. Therefore, Japan, with its allies and partners, will continue to stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Kyoto, for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank the Secretary General for his briefing. We have convened to mark 2 years since the Russian Federation launched its unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine. This war and its continuation is an affront to the UN Charter, the work of the Security Council, and the architecture of international peace and security. As members of this Council, we all have a collective responsibility to uphold the UN Charter. It is on us to further advance the implementation of the resolutions adopted by the General Assembly during its emergency special session on Ukraine. We must honor the calls of the Secretary General for diplomatic solutions. All these elements are critical to restoring international peace and security. Madam President, the number of civilian casualties in Ukraine significantly increased in December and January compared with previous months. OHCHR has verified that 158 civilians were killed and 48 injured solely in January. Since the beginning of this war, there has been over 30,000 civilian casualties and more than 14 million people in need of humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. The deportation and forced transfer of children is of particular concern. According to the Ukrainian National Information Bureau, over 19,000 children have been deported or forcibly displaced. In this regard, Malta recalls the Independent Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council, as well as the Secretary General's annual report on children in armed conflict, which shed a light on Russia's violations against children. The consequences of this conflict have also impacted women and girls. They have been disproportionately impacted, since they are at far greater risk of gender-based and conflict-related sexual abuse. Despite the horror and trauma that many have experienced over the past 24 months, Ukrainian women and girls have shown remarkable courage and resilience. Millions of them are playing a crucial role in providing humanitarian aid. Madam President, Malta is firmly committed to international law and the UN Charter. We therefore reaffirm our strong support towards all ongoing accountability processes. These include the important work of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Those responsible for the crimes committed in Ukraine must be held accountable. There can be no lasting peace without justice. We must also not forget that by terminating the Black Sea Grain Initiative, Russia has also taken the world's population hostage by blocking Ukrainian grain exports, all the while stealing grain from occupied Ukrainian territories and destroying Ukrainian grain facilities. In the face of this unilateral blockade, the EU has strengthened its support to Ukraine and to the global food security. The EU will keep on investing in the Solidarity Lanes Action Plan, which has allowed Ukraine to export 67 million tons of grain, oilseeds, and related products since May 2022. In closing, Madam President, Malta will continue to support all efforts to address the consequences of Russia's aggression. We also reiterate that the only step towards a just and lasting peace would be for Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and unconditionally, completely withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. Today's meeting, convened at the initiative of a number of Western states, is like deja vu. A year ago in the same room, the Maltese presidency to mark the one-year anniversary of our special military operation, where foreign ministers were brought together to read an anti-Russian statement that was copied under dictation. A year ago, the Western Bloc was very much tried to promote its peaceful initiatives, which in essence were reduced to the cunning statement from Orwell, war is peace. At the same time, the West openly instilled in Zelensky, who was no rocket scientist when it comes to strategic thinking, the absurd illusion that with Western support he could defeat Russia on the field of battle. Particularly certain gentlemen from the wonderful garden try very hard, for whom anyone who is not part of the golden billion are trash. The European Union also, following Orwell, continued to supply weapons to the Kiev regime using the money from the Peace Fund. Another year has passed since then. Ukraine has completely failed in its loudly broadcast counteroffensive, and yet the West continues to pump the Kiev regime full of weaponry, encouraging it to throw more and more lives of Ukrainians in the flame of conflict, which the United States already is setting aside any decorum, now calls a profitable business venture. In fact, that's because it's become so profitable for the military-industrial complex. In parallel, there's a stubborn attempt to promote some kind of process to discuss some kind of completely dead-end pseudo-peace formula at different meetups, where either in Copenhagen or in Davos, using various tricks, countries from the global south and east were dragged into these events in order to then present this as broad international support. At the same time, it is clear that the countries of the global majority clearly see the real background of these intrigues and have no wish to play the role of extras in them, just as they understand that it's completely pointless to discuss anything without the participation of Russia. So what has this year brought for Ukraine? Hundreds of thousands senseless victims, a looming collapse of its economy, a deep crisis of its statehood and governance. Because for the people of Ukraine, it's increasingly clear how ineffective and how the ineffective its government and how much it lacks independence. Wallowing in corruption, this government cannot even meet its basic social obligations, while it badgers Western donors without success for money to even pay their pensions to citizens.
Молодое, теперь уже и не молодое
The
поколение.
younger generation, and now already
Отлавливают
not so
на
young
улице, как
generation,
скот,
is
и
being
бросают в мясные
nabbed on the
штурмы,
streets
призванные
like
показать
animals, and
западным
then
спонсорам,
are
что их
thrown into
положение
meat
себя
grinder assaults in order to show to Western sponsors that their investments are bringing
Мы сегодня
returns.
услышали, еще
Today
услышим
we
много
heard, and we will
пафосности.
hear many pompous statements.
Однако на самом деле
However,
Запад
in
заинтересован
fact,
совершенно
the
не в том,
West
чтобы
is
помочь Украине.
not interested at all in helping the Ukraine.
Западной
The
политики в
essence
отношении
of
Украины
Western
недавно откровенно
policy
суммировала главный
towards
редактор
Ukraine was
британского издания
recently
«Экономист»
summarized by the
Зенни
editor-in-chief
Минтон-Бедуэс.
of The Economist, Zeni Minton-Bedoues.
Она заявила в телеинтервью,
She
цитирую,
claimed in a television interview, and here I quote,
«Дать Украине деньги – это самый
giving
дешевый
money
способ
to
для
the Ukraine
Соединенных Штатов
is the
укрепить
cheapest
свою
way for the
безопасность».
United States to strengthen its
Это
security.
украинцы ведут бои.
The Ukrainians are
Это
fighting.
их убивают.
They're being killed.
США и Европа поставляют им
The
оружие.
United States and Europe are simply
И
supplying
делая
them
это,
with
мы
weapons, and by
противодействуем
doing
Путину.
this, we are
Конец
pushing
цитаты.
back against Putin. The end of quote.
Расплачиваясь за свои интересы жизнями сегодняшних туземцев,
By
украинцев,
paying
как
for
они
their
считают,
interests
Запад
with the
во главе
lives of
США в лучших
contemporary
неоколониальных
Aborigines, that is the
традициях
Ukrainians,
пытается решить свои
the West
геополитические
headed
задачи
by the United
и не
States
допустить
in the
того,
best new
чтобы
colonial
Вашингтон
traditions
потерял
is trying to
присвоенную самому себе роль мирового гегемона,
find solutions to its
или
geopolitical
чтобы в мире
tasks and to
укрепились
make
другие
sure that
мощные и
Washington
самодостаточные.
doesn't lose its self-appointed role as the global
Как бы то ни
policeman
было, сегодня
and
уже очевидно,
not to see
что
other
в этой войне по
powerful
доверенности
and
Соединенных
self-sufficient
Штатов,
poles
Евросоюза и НАТО против России руками
emerge in the
украинцев
world. Whatever happens,
Украина
it's become
проигрывает.
clear that in this proxy war, the United States, EU, and NATO against Russia by using the hands of the Ukrainians, Ukraine is losing.
И что не менее важно, как
And
бы
what is no
тяжело
less
ни было
important, no
принять
matter
этот
how
вывод нашим
difficult
европейским коллегам,
it'll be to accept this
она не
conclusion for our
единственный
European
проигравший от этого
colleagues,
конфликта.
Ukraine is not the only one
Едва
who
ли
is
не
losing
главный
from this
проигравший,
conflict.
это сам
Perhaps
Европейский
the
Союз.
most important loser is the European Union itself.
Хотел бы, пользуясь случаем,
Taking this
обратиться к представителям
opportunity,
стран
I'd like to
Евросоюза.
address the representatives
Вы
of the
так
European
долго
Union.
выстраивали европейский проект.
For such a long time,
Гордились
you
тем, что
built the
вам
European
удалось
project. You were
сформировать
proud
общую
that you
внешнюю
managed
политику в области
to
безопасности.
mold common foreign policy and common security
Мы
policy.
помним те
We
времена, когда
remember the
Евросоюз лелеял
times when
планы
the
на
European
собственную
Union nurtured
геополитическую роль,
plans for its
имел
own
особое
independent
мнение по
geopolitical
целому ряду
role,
ключевых
had its own
международных проблем.
opinion for a whole range of key international issues.
Поражает, как легко
It's
вы расстались со
incredible
всеми
how
этими
quickly you've
амбициями,
given
по
up all
команде
these
вернувшись в
ambitions.
строй послушных сателлитов
As soon as
США.
the order came, you got back into line as obedient satellites of the United States.
Конфликт на
The
Украине, который
conflict
так
in
старательно
Ukraine,
подпитываете,
which
выгребая остатки
you are
из
so
европейских
diligently
арсеналов,
stoking by
обостряет
scraping the
миграционные
bottom
проблемы наших
of
стран.
the European arsenals for
Бьет
any
по вашей
remaining
энергетической
weaponry,
сфере.
is only worsening migration problems in your
Как мы
country
узнали на
and
этой
is
неделе,
undermining
прямые
your
потери
energy
одной только
sector.
Германии,
As we
считавшейся локомотивом
learned this week,
ЕС,
the
одной
direct
разницы
losses
Соединенных
of
Штатов
just Germany,
и
which is
российских
considered the
санкций,
locomotive
составили
of
как
the
минимум
EU,
200 миллиардов
due
долларов.
to the anti-Russian sanctions imposed by the United States, is at least $200 billion.
В чем тут, собственно, европейский
So,
интерес?
where is
Жаль,
the
что вы
European interest
забыли о
in
том,
this?
что
It's
Соединенные
unfortunate
Штаты и
that you have
Великобритания
forgotten
всегда
that
являлись
the U.S.
главными
and
бенефициарами любого конфликта
Great
на
Britain have
территории
always
континентальной
been the main
Европы
beneficiaries
и
of any
целенаправленно
conflict on the
разжигали
territory of
противоречия на этом
continental Europe. They
пространстве, чтобы
intentionally
не допустить
stoke
появления
conflicts in
еще
this
одного геополитического
region
конкурента.
so as not to allow for the
Объединенная
emergence of
Европа,
another
живущая в мире и
geopolitical competitor.
сотрудничестве со
That is
своим
a
соседом
unified
Россией.
Europe living in peace and cooperation with its neighbor Russia.
Вам последовательно, через проводивших
Consistently,
американские интересы
through
младоевропейцев,
the
впрыскивали
efforts of new
русофобские яд и в
European
итоге
members who
полностью
are
отравили.
promoting EU interests, you've been introduced the poison of Russophobia.
И теперь вместо
And have been
стратегического
poisoned.
партнерства
And
и выгодных
today, instead
совместных
of strategic
экономических
partnership
проектов,
and
вы
mutually
рисуете
beneficial
Россию
economic
образ врага и
projects, you're
стреляете себе в
depicting
ногу,
Russia as an
якобы
enemy, and you're
освобождаясь от
shooting yourself in the foot
энергозависимости от
by
нашей страны,
supposedly
и попадая
freeing
в еще
yourself from
более
energy
жесткую
dependency on our
энергозависимость
country
от Соединенных
while
Штатов.
becoming even more
Более
dependent
того,
on
сегодня не только Украина, но и вся
falling
Европа
into
рискует
harsher
вновь стать
dependence on the
плацдармом
United
военного
States. Furthermore,
противостояния, в которое вас
not only
последовательно
Ukraine, but all
втягивают
of
из-за
Europe
океана.
risks becoming a theater of a military confrontation, which you're being drawn into from across the ocean.
Нужно ли это населению европейских стран?
Do the people of Europe really need this?
Хочется верить, что нет.
I'd like to believe that they don't.
Опрос общественного мнения, проведенный в
Opinion
январе в
polls
12
conducted in
европейских
January
странах,
in 12
показывают, что
European
только
countries show
10%
that only
европейцев верят,
10%
что
of
Украина
Europeans
может победить
believe that Ukraine can defeat Russia.
Бунтуют европейские фермеры,
European farmers are
не
rebelling.
желая потерять
They don't want to
сельскохозяйственные рынки
lose
из-за демпинга
agricultural
украинских
markets due
экспортеров.
to the dumping by Ukrainian exporters.
Широко разошлись кадры скандалов на
Been widely
польско-украинской
viewed
границе, где
footage
польские
of
пограничники
scandals
отказываются пропускать
on the
украинских
Polish-Ukrainian
производителей зерна.
border, where Polish border guards
Очевидно,
refuse to
что
allow
никакое
Ukrainian
европейское
trucks with
будущее
grain. It's
на
clear
сквозь
that there will be
коррумпированной
no
криминальной
European
Украине с нищим
future
населением,
for the completely
которую ее
corrupt and
всесоюзной
criminalized Ukraine
жительница
with its
превратила
dirt
нынешнее
poor
марионеточное
inhabitants.
руководство, теперь
A
не
country that was once the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, but has completely
Украине
been
с момента
destroyed by its
обретения
puppet
формальной
government.
независимости
Because
отводилась
Ukraine, since it
незавидная роль
became
антироссийского
formally
оппозиции.
independent, was to play the role of an anti-Russian bridgehead.
В 2004 году в ней состоялся, по сути, первый
What occurred was the
срежиссированный
first
Западом антиконституционный
staged
переворот,
Western
который в итоге народ не
anti-constitutional coup,
поддержал.
which ultimately the
Тогда
people of Ukraine
Запад
did
стал
not
готовить
support.
переворот таким
Then the
образом,
West
чтобы больше
began
не было
to plan
осечек,
its
чтобы
coup in such
навсегда
a way that there would be
изничтожить
no more
патриотически
misfires,
ориентированную
in order to
оппозицию.
destroy once and for all the
Именно это
patriotically
и
oriented
происходит все
opposition.
годы
This is
после
precisely
Майданного
what has been
переворота
going on
2014
since the
года.
Maidan coup of 2014.
Приход к власти, спонсируемый
Now,
западными русофобами,
the
националистами и неонацистами в 2014
neo-nationalists
году
and
ознаменовал
neo-Nazis that came to
водораздел
power in
новейшей истории
2014 with the support of the West, this represented a watershed in the
Антиконституционный
recent
государственный
history of
переворот,
Ukraine.
десятилетие
The
которого приходится как
anti-constitutional
раз на
coup
эти дни, стал
d'etat,
возможен в
whose
результате
10th-year
неприкрытого
anniversary
вмешательства во внутренние
we
дела этой
are
страны.
witnessing today became possible as a result of an unconcealed interference into the internal affairs of this
Таким
country.
образом, было положено начало форсированному
Thus
втягиванию
spelled
Киева
the
в авантюрные
beginning
проекты по
of
нанесению России
drawing
стратегического
Kiev into the
поражения,
dangerous
взят
gambles
курс на
meant to inflict a
игнорирование
strategic
интересов
defeat
и поправление
against Russia,
прав жителей
thus
Юго-Востока
taking the
страны.
path of ignoring the interests of its people and
Против тех, кто
trampling on the
стремился
rights
сохранить свою
of
идентичность,
the
свои
inhabitants
исторические
of the
культурные корни, была развязана
southeast.
жестокая и
These people
бесчеловечная,
merely
так
sought to preserve their
называемая
identity, their
антитеррористическая
historical and
операция,
cultural roots.
в ходе
Against them, a
которой
cruel
в
and
нарушение
inhumane
Конституции Украины
anti-terrorist
были задействованы
operation was
армия
launched.
и
During that
национальные
operation, in breach of the
националистические
constitution of Ukraine, the army and national battalions were deployed.
националистические батальоны.
Nationalist battalions were deployed.
В Донбассе не было террористов,
There were
что
no
своим недавним
terrorists in the
решением
Donbass,
подтвердил
which was
Международный суд ООН.
confirmed in its recent decision by the
Все это
International
привело
Court
к
of Justice. All
деградации
this
украинской
has led to the
государственности, дальнейшей
deterioration of
радикализации,
Ukrainian statehood,
росту
further
национализма и
radicalization,
многочисленным
growth in
жертвам среди
nationalism,
мирного
and multiple victims among the peaceful population.
Представитель британских
The
кукловодов
representative
киевского режима вопрошал в этом зале, не жалко ли
the
нам посылать
representative
воевать на Украину наших сынов.
The British stated that
Вопрошал в этом зале, не жалко ли нам посылать воевать на Украину наших сынов.
asked us whether we fear or we regret sending our sons to fight in Ukraine.
Конечно, жалко.
Of course, we regret this very much.
Жалко и несчастных украинцев, которых посылают умирать за геополитические интересы Запада.
We also pity the poor Ukrainians who are sent to die to further the interests of the West.
Вот только он, я имею в виду представитель Великобритании, в традиционной западной лицемерной манере умолчал о том, что мы делали это 2 года назад не для того, чтобы начать войну, а для того, чтобы ее остановить.
Hypocritically forgot to mention that we did this. We sent our boys to fight 2 years ago, not to start a war, but to prevent a war.
To finish
it, rather.
Остановить войну, которую 8 лет вел поддерживаемый вами режим против мирного населения Донбасса.
8 years by a regime that was supported by you, a war against the Donbass.
Жертвами которой уже на тот момент стали более 14 тысяч человек.
By that time, already 14,000 people had become victims of that war. That was the main reason for the start of the special military
Что
operation.
касается вопроса о том, с кем мы воюем на Украине, то на него вы можете ответить сами, если вспомните, что киевский режим почитает в качестве героев. Кого киевский режим почитает в качестве героев? Кто такие, например, Бандера и Шухевич, отряды которых вместе с нацистами убили сотни тысяч евреев, поляков, русских,
regiments and units together with the SS and Nazis killed hundreds of thousands of Poles and Ukrainians. Or ask Mr. Sikorsky, who will take the floor later, and he'll tell you about the Volyn massacre by the Ukrainian army and how it is remembered in Poland.
We believe that if leaders of a country glorify Nazis, speak like Nazis, and allow for the demonstrations using Nazi symbols, they are Nazis. You are simply too cowardly and too myopic to acknowledge all this. Once again, using the presence of Mr. Séjourné and Mr. Cameron today, who left the room. Unfortunately, neither of them is in the room now. I would like to raise another quite uncomfortable, has been uncomfortable issue for our Western colleagues. That is the Minsk agreements. About a year ago, we all heard the admission of Petro Poroshenko, François Hollande, Angela Merkel, as well as Boris Johnson, about the fact that neither France nor Germany, not even Great Britain, never took these agreements seriously. And they did not intend to encourage the Ukrainian authorities to fulfill them. They simply used them to give Kiev time to prepare for war with Russia. This, in essence, was an admission of guilt by the leaders of the states, openly and even proudly acknowledging how they intentionally violated Resolution 2202 of the Security Council, which endorsed the Minsk agreements. That does not prevent the representatives of these states, as though none of that happened, to speak today with lectures and lecture other members about the importance of complying with international law and violating resolutions of the Security Council. Rather, they call for the respect of an international rules-based order, based on rules which they themselves invented for their own benefit. All these years since the signature of the Minsk agreements, the Kiev regime continued its military preparation, strengthening its military potential of the Ukrainian armed forces, stepped up its military cooperation with foreign states. Only after all attempts to convince the Ukrainians to as well as its Western sponsors, to implement in good faith and fully the fundamental document for resolving the Ukrainian conflict, a package of measures of the Minsk agreements. Only once all these attempts proved to be in vain was the decision made to begin a special military operation to protect the lives of the inhabitants of Donbas in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. Madam President, today our American colleague trying to find new reasons to criticize or to attack Russia, mentioned that Alexei Navalny, who was convicted based on actual accusations, died in prison. Can you tell me then for what reason the Ukrainian regime killed Gonzalo Lira in prison? You didn't do anything to prevent that. You didn't mention anything of that or any of the other crimes committed by the Kiev regime. Distinguished colleagues, any conflict ends sooner or later. There's no doubt that the Ukrainian conflict will end as well. There's no doubt that the longer it lasts, due to the sustained support by the West, the less advantageous will be the peace conditions for Ukraine. In the long run, what will be important is what kind of conclusions the West will draw from this. Will it continue with suicidal stubbornness to impose on the rest of the world its one-sided rules-based order, trying to divide the world into satellites and enemies, or will it engage in meaningful dialogue to find a way to build a truly just world order where the interests of all states will be guaranteed? For now, we have to note with regret that Europe is in the throes of strategic blindness. It sees the architecture of Euro-Atlantic security through the sight of a weapon, fueling its own fears about the Russian threat against which it needs to defend itself, while denying to Russia its own legitimate defense interests. This is a short-sighted and flawed approach, which undermines the basic principles of the indivisibility of security. You're stoking laughable fears about the supposed upcoming aggression of Russia against European countries. Perhaps you have forgotten that it was European states at different historical periods. Poland, Sweden, France, Germany, and a whole range of its satellites, almost all of Europe during World War II, attacked the Russian state with remarkable single-mindedness, trying to defeat it, and always unsuccessfully. The United States tried to do the same thing during the Cold War. It's well known the disreputable role of Great Britain. Its diplomacy was always sophisticated in pitting countries against each other, pitting nations against each other, and continues to do so. The Russian statehood was shaped in conditions of constant external threats. Our peace-loving Western colleagues don't like to remember the fact that it was Russia who always had to beat back aggressions. But our people remember that very well. We know that this anti-Russian propaganda against the mythical Russian threat is believed less and less by the public in Western countries. That is why it is being wrapped up in layers of lies in order to not allow the truth through. But it has gotten through anyway, thanks to the efforts of those who understand what the world risks by continued confrontation. When there are such information breakthroughs, such as the one that took place during the interview by the American journalist Tucker Carlson, whose interview with the president of Russia opened the eyes of millions around the world. Now, beyond today's moment, increasingly becomes necessary to discuss a fair and indivisible system of Euro-Atlantic security. In its current distorted version, it only is in the interest of the United States and its allies in NATO, which adopted the right to interfere in international affairs and into international affairs of other states. Western leaders fooled us during the years of the Cold War and want to continue to fool us now. They consider the rights of NATO to continue to expand as an absolute right and transforming any corner of the world into the area of responsibility of the alliance. I want to just recall that Russia proposed a substantive dialogue on security guarantees at the end of 2021 and put forward specific proposals to the U.S. and NATO, but they were arrogantly rejected. The result was a new hot conflict in Europe. The West left us no choice. We were forced to defend our people and our future at the same time. We never refused negotiations. The Kiev regime itself refused itself to engage in negotiations. I want to stress it is still possible to maintain Ukraine in some kind of form, but it must be a peaceful, neutral Ukraine with which there are no discriminations or Russophobia, and where Nazi criminals are not glorified, and which does not represent a threat to Russia. That is the goal of our special military operation. This is why the choice by the collective West will be necessary. They will need to find some common sense in order to save something from Ukraine.
Of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I thank Secretary General Mr. Guterres for his earlier briefing. The ongoing Ukraine crisis is threatening to become a protracted, compounded, and wider one. This tragedy that could have been avoided has become what it is today. This is both distressing and worthy of deep reflection. The international community should pull together in the search for a just and sensible solution to settle the crisis politically and let peace prevail as soon as possible. First, efforts should remain focused on a political settlement. The Ukraine crisis has caused incalculable damage. The most pressing priority of the hour is to stop hostilities, launch peace talks, and restore peace. Peace is in the interest of all parties. The sooner peace talks begin, the less the damage that is done. Any action that is conducive to peace and greater trust, however small it may seem, is worth our bona fide effort as long as
there is a glimmer of hope. We call upon the parties concerned to show a sense of responsibility and make constructive diplomatic efforts to promote the de-escalation and détente. It is favorable conditions for the resumption of negotiations they should be creating, not man-made obstacles to make peace harder to achieve, much less to supply weapons, stoke the fire and pour oil on it, and to profit from the prolonged crisis. We look forward to greater efforts by the UN to promote peace talks and alleviate the humanitarian situation. Second, we must stay the course towards common security, which is our overarching goal. In the face of complexities and challenges, we must be firmly committed to the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security. We must respect the legitimate social concerns of all countries and never lose sight of the fact that security is indivisible, that one country's security cannot be compromised at the expense of other countries' security, and that regional security cannot be guaranteed by strengthening or even expanding a military bloc. The legitimate security interests and concerns of all countries should be taken seriously and addressed properly. It must be pointed out that the situation that Europe is facing today is closely related to the repeated eastward expansion of NATO since the end of the Cold War. We encourage NATO to do some soul-searching, come out of the cage of Cold War mentality, and refrain from acting as an agent of troubles, instigating bloc confrontation. We urge the head of NATO to look at the world through an objective lens, stop saber-rattling, and do that which is genuinely conducive to world peace. Third, the spillover effects of the crisis must be proactively managed. The world is in enough turmoil as it is. It cannot afford to be hit by more crises that are bigger than what we already have. Attempting to solve problems by creating more problems doesn't work. Certain countries using the Ukrainian crisis as a pretext has indiscriminately imposed unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction and have exerted unjustified pressure on the businesses of other countries, which have adversely impacted the global industrial chain, supply chain, and disrupted the order of global trade. The world economy is interdependent, and it is wrong to instrumentalize or weaponize the world economy. China firmly opposes the unlawful sanctions imposed on Chinese companies by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union using the Ukraine issue as their excuse. China will continue to take necessary measures to safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese enterprises and citizens. Fourth, we must actively advocate the equitable and orderly multipolarization of the world. The Cold War ended over 30 years ago. Since then, the international landscape has undergone profound adjustments, and the multipolarization of the world has picked up pace. This is the trend of our times, the tide of history. Humanity is a community with a shared future. All countries, large and small, are equal members of the global community when it comes to international relations and are entitled to a place on the international arena. All countries should jointly abide by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, adhere to the universally accepted basic norms governing international relations, and practice genuine multilateralism together without selective application or double standards. For the world to slide back to the colonial age is not an option. International affairs should not be monopolized by a minority of countries trying to obstruct other countries' progress through hegemony and bullying is not right, and it won't work. On the other hand, major countries have a special responsibility for world peace and security and must conduct their relations responsibly and manage their differences properly in pursuit of win-win cooperation. Madam President, China played no part in the creation of the Ukraine crisis, nor is China a party to the crisis itself. We have not been watching the inferno from across the river, much less cashing in on the crisis. On the question of Ukraine, China has always maintained that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected, the purposes and principles of the UN Charter observed. the legitimate security concerns of all countries given due regard, and all efforts conducive to the peaceful resolution of the crisis supported. China's constructive role and unremitting efforts towards a political settlement of the Ukraine issue will continue. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President.
Empiezo por agradecer al secretario general por su intervención y sus incansables esfuerzos por la paz. Reconozco la presencia de las altas autoridades que han estado presentes en esta Cámara. Han pasado exactamente 729 días desde que inició la agresión militar rusa a Ucrania, en clara violación de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y del derecho internacional. El Ecuador recuerda con pesar la sesión de emergencia mantenida por este órgano la noche del 23 de febrero del 2022, pues en la misma se confirmarían las acciones injustificables que atentaron contra la soberanía y la integridad territorial de Ucrania. En estos 2 años hemos sido testigos de la devastación que el conflicto ha infligido al pueblo ucraniano, junto con sus repercusiones negativas en el ámbito global. Ha perturbado economías, comprometido la seguridad energética y agravado la inseguridad alimentaria a nivel mundial. La tierra fértil que durante siglos ha nutrido a millones de personas alrededor del planeta, hoy se encuentra asolada por la contaminación, los bombardeos y las minas. Esta guerra ha desencadenado una crisis humanitaria inconmensurable, con miles de vidas perdidas, entre ellos cientos de niños, además de millones de personas desplazadas. A esto se suman los daños devastadores en infraestructura crítica, energética, residencial, sanitaria, educativa, productiva, religiosa y cultural en Ucrania. Los ataques en zonas pobladas representan una de las facetas más trágicas y condenables del conflicto. Han causado muertes indiscriminadas y sufrimiento a civiles. El impacto psicológico y el trauma de vivir bajo constante amenaza afectará negativamente a varias generaciones. Reconocemos la labor incansable de los organismos humanitarios que trabajan para aliviar el sufrimiento de la población civil. Sin embargo, la magnitud de la crisis requiere una respuesta más amplia que asegure una asistencia humanitaria inmediata y que considere además las necesidades de reconstrucción del país. Al Ecuador le preocupa el peligro que suponen los ataques en los alrededores de las instalaciones nucleares. Por ello, reitero la necesidad de cumplir con los 7 pilares de seguridad nuclear y confirmo el apoyo de mi país a las tareas realizadas por el Organismo Internacional de Energía Atómica y al cumplimiento de los 5 principios fundamentales para garantizar la seguridad en la planta de Zaporizhia. Me pregunto, ¿cuántas sesiones de este Consejo serán necesarias para que se cumplan las obligaciones estipuladas en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y el derecho internacional, incluido el derecho internacional humanitario? Señora Presidenta, a pesar de los amplios esfuerzos de movilización por parte del sistema de las Naciones Unidas, el multilateralismo se ha visto sometido a una prueba de fuego, obligándonos a reflexionar sobre la eficacia de nuestras herramientas y mecanismos para prevenir y responder a las crisis. Si bien un veto impuesto el 25 de febrero del 2022 impidió que el Consejo de Seguridad actúe decisivamente, este no logró impedir que la Asamblea General se pronuncie con contundencia. En el marco del 11º periodo extraordinario de sesiones de emergencia, esa Asamblea adoptó 6 resoluciones que, entre otras cosas, reafirmaron su compromiso con la soberanía e integridad territorial de Ucrania, pidieron un cese a las hostilidades y reiteraron la existencia que la Federación Rusa retire de inmediato, por completo y sin condiciones, todas sus fuerzas militares del territorio de Ucrania. De igual manera,
Similarly,
con la declaración de la presidencia
with
del 6
the
de mayo del
presidential statement
2022,
on the 6th of May
este Consejo se mostró
2022, this
unido al
Council
expresar su
stood as
profunda
one in
preocupación
expressing its
por la
great
paz
concern
y la seguridad en
about peace and
Ucrania
security
y
in
reconoció
Ukraine,
que,
and it recognized
en virtud de la
that
Carta,
pursuant to the
todos los
Charter,
Estados miembros
all
han
member
asumido
states
la
are
obligación de
required
arreglar sus
to settle
controversias
their
internacionales
international
por
disputes
medios
by peaceful
pacíficos.
means.
Señora Presidenta,
Madam President,
el llamado del Secretario General a dar una oportunidad
the
a la paz
Secretary General's
es
appeal
un
to
eco de
give
nuestro
peace a
anhelo
chance
común.
echoes our common desire.
Luego de 2 años de iniciada
After
la
2
invasión
years
y varios más de
following the
devastación y
invasion and many
sufrimiento
more
para las poblaciones
incursions
del este
causing
de Ucrania,
devastation and suffering for
es
people in the
momento de
east of
retornar
Ukraine,
a la
it is
mesa
time
de
to return to the
negociaciones.
negotiating table.
Instamos
We
a
urge
todas las
all
partes
parties
implicadas
involved
a
to
considerar
consider,
de buena fe
in good faith,
todas las posibilidades
all
conducentes a una
options
solución
conducive
pacífica de
to a
controversias.
peaceful settlement of this dispute.
Transitamos tiempos de
We
incertidumbre,
are living in uncertain
donde las
times
tensiones
where
geopolíticas se
geopolitical
agudizan en
tensions
diversos
have
puntos del
heightened
globo.
in various parts of the
La
globe.
posibilidad
The
de una escalada
possibility
hacia un
of an
conflicto
escalation
global
towards a global conflict
representa la amenaza más
is
grave
the
para
most
nuestra
serious
existencia.
threat to our existence.
La carrera
The
armamentística,
arms race,
lejos de haberse
far from
detenido,
slowing down,
se acelera.
has sped up.
La agresión militar contra
Military
Ucrania
aggression
es
against
una tragedia
Ukraine
para los previos
is
de
a
Rusia
tragedy for the people of Russia and
y por
Ukraine,
tanto
and therefore
debe terminar
must end.
y debe terminar ya.
It must end
El
now.
Ecuador, fiel a sus principios
Ecuador,
históricos,
faithful
reitera
to its historic
con
principles,
solidaridad su
reiterates
solidaridad
its
con la soberanía e
solidarity
integridad
with the
territorial
sovereignty and
de
territorial
Ucrania
integrity of
e
Ukraine.
insiste en el llamado a la
And
Federación
we
Rusa
also reiterate the
a que
appeal
suspenda sus
to the Russian
operaciones
Federation to
militares,
suspend its military
conforme le fue
operations
ordenado por la
as
Corte
called for by
Internacional de
the
Justicia el
ICJ
16 de
on the
marzo del
16th of March
2022,
2022,
de manera que se pueda
so
avanzar
that
sin más demora
immediate
hacia una paz
progress
justa y
can be made
duradera
towards just and
basada en el
lasting
derecho
peace based
internacional
on
y
international
los
law
principios
and on the
de la Carta de las
principles
Naciones Unidas.
of the United Nations
Muchas gracias.
Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, Mozambique thanks the presidency of Guyana for convening this meeting. We are grateful to the Secretary General for his insightful statement. We highly commend his complete devotion in promoting peace and security worldwide and in urging all member states to uphold the purposes and principles of the Charter of our organization and the tenets of international law. Madam President, as we mark the 2-year milestone since February 2022, when the conflict between Russia and Ukraine intensified into a larger scale war, the ensuing global distress and instability have had a profound and far-reaching impact that cannot be overstated. The conflict has injected a profound sense of uncertainty and turmoil into the heart of Europe. It has severely strained an international system already grappling with numerous fault lines and challenges across all continents. Despite the substantial resources allocated by this Council to address the issue, the conflict appears to be veering towards a gloomy direction, with the severity of consequences escalating ominously. In light of the severe humanitarian, political, and economic consequences of the conflict, coupled with the genuine risk of a nuclear deflagration by accident, miscalculation, or otherwise, we believe a significant course adjustment is necessary with the diplomacy assuming a central role. It is our understanding that for diplomacy to bear fruit, all parties must overcome the limitations of the current approach based solely on confrontation and use of force. In this context, it is our collective duty as representatives of our states to strongly encourage a negotiated settlement of the conflict in accordance with the charter that guides our organization. As we navigate through bloody conflicts in Africa, Middle East, and Asia, it is crucial that we bear in mind the interconnected nature of global peace and security. We do believe peace and security are indivisible and are of interest to the entire humankind. Madam President, we remain convinced and have consistently maintained that responsible and genuine dialogue is the only viable means to resolve this conflict. Against this background, Mozambique firmly advocates a political and negotiated solution as the most viable way to end the conflict. This is the solid path for a lasting and sustainable peace between the two sister countries and two neighboring countries. To achieve this, we urge the parties to cease hostilities without delay, to resume direct negotiations without preconditions, and engage in dialogue in good faith. The cause of peace compels us that we encourage the parties to return to the negotiating table and embrace the imperfections of a compromise in the name of peace and security in Ukraine, in Europe, and in the world. Mozambique will always support every effort towards silencing the guns in Ukraine. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for convening this meeting. My thanks go also to the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his insightful briefing. 2 years have passed since the crisis in Ukraine started, and hopes of reaching sustaining peace remain unattainable. The continuing deterioration of the humanitarian situation and the impact of the ongoing hostilities on civilians are a source of serious concern for Algeria, who had very friendly relations with both countries. The loss of civilian lives, the suffering of refugees and internally displaced persons caused by this conflict are profoundly worrying. Critical infrastructure, such as energy facilities and agri-food system, were heavily impacted, with significant consequences felt worldwide, notably in Africa and developing countries. In the face of these challenges, the Council, whose primary responsibility is the maintenance of international peace and security failed, yes, failed to pave the way for any consensual way out to the crisis. From day one at this Council, we have repeatedly expressed our concern about all the violations of international law, including international humanitarian law. We often stressed that continued escalation is neither beneficial nor granting peace to any of the parties. The polarization is only exacerbating tensions and jeopardizing prospects for sustainable peace. Madam President, today I would like to focus on what we didn't witness during these 2 years, or I should say what we wish to see in the nearest future. First, it is high time to deploy the necessary diplomatic effort to achieve de-escalation of tension between the parties so that we can put an end as soon as possible to the loss of lives and people suffering. Second, the concerned parties must show their willingness and readiness to engage in an inclusive and constructive dialogue. The two parties need to be guided by the spirit of good faith and without preconditions towards a peaceful settlement of this dispute within the implementation of the international law and the international humanitarian law. Third, we urge the parties to agree on a just and a lasting peace based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and their legitimate security concerns. Four, we emphasize the need to ensure a more coordinated and harmonized diplomatic action among the international community. The noble objective here will be to bring together the concerned parties and guarantee a more efficient and comprehensive diplomatic process to end this crisis. Obviously, political will is key to achieve tangible progress and mutually acceptable solution. Equally important is the consistency of this Council in upholding its responsibility in the protection of civilians, implementing the international humanitarian law and the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. Yes, all the pillars of the Charter. For its part, Algeria will remain actively engaged in the Security Council to promote a peaceful and a political solution to this crisis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Madam President, I thank you for convening this briefing. I also thank the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his very informative briefing. Tomorrow, the 24th of February 2024, will mark exactly 2 years since the start of the conflict in Ukraine. The war has had profound repercussions that have gone beyond regional boundaries. This conflict has been protracted to the extent that the prospects for a peaceful settlement between Russia and Ukraine remains elusive, with both countries continuing to rely on military means to influence the war's outcome. There is thus a seeming stalemate with devastating consequences for civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, and far-reaching effects on the geopolitical landscape and global economy. In the 2 years of the brutal conflict, more than 47,000 incidents involving armed clashes, airstrikes, and other attacks occurred across Ukraine in 2023 alone. These incidents caused increased civilian deaths, widespread damage, and destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, and other vital civil infrastructure, including energy. The cost of the conflict has been excessively high. According to the OHCHR, civilian casualties in Ukraine have exceeded 30,000, with over 10,000 killed and 19,000 injured since the full-scale conflict. It is believed that the actual figures are considerably higher. The International Organization for Migration has reported that the destruction of residential buildings has left nearly 720,000 people in the worst-affected parts of Ukraine with no access to adequate and safe housing. In Kherson Oblast, for example, nearly 30% of people live in damaged buildings. Access to education remains highly constrained, with almost half of all educational institutions damaged or destroyed in Kharkiv and Kherson, and a staggering 80% in Donetsk, according to the Ministry of Education and humanitarian partners. Access to health has also been impacted, with over 1,500 attacks on healthcare facilities verified by the WHO since February 2022. Nearly half of health centers are now rendered non-functional in some parts of the East and South. Sierra Leone condemns all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure and emphasized that these attacks are prohibited under international law. We call on all sides to comply with applicable international law, in particular, international humanitarian law. Madam President, the distressing attack against civilians and civilian infrastructure have caused the fastest growing and largest displacement crisis in Europe. The UNHCR approximates that 10 million people have been forcibly displaced by the war as at last month, including 3.7 million internally displaced people and 6.3 million refugees who have fled Ukraine for abroad. As at the end of 2023, 5.9 million refugees from Ukraine were recorded across Europe. OCHA estimates that there are now over 14.6 million people in dire need of humanitarian assistance, including the approximately 10 million forcibly displaced people. About 3.3 million people living in frontline communities are grappling with severe shortages of resources and constant bombardment. Children have not been spared from the brunt and brutality of the conflict. Allegations of gross violation of the protection measures for children during armed conflicts have been reported. Destruction of healthcare facilities have exposed millions to increased trauma and mental health issues and impacted children's well-being. Additionally, the attacks on schools have had a significant impact on educational activities. Reportedly across the country, only 1/3 of children are attending classes entirely in person, while 1/3 are learning through a mixed in-person and online approach, and another 1/3 are fully learning online. In view of the above, Sierra Leone commends humanitarian aid agencies for considerably expanding the humanitarian operations over the past 2 years to respond to the growing and deteriorating needs that followed the escalation of the conflict. As hostilities along the front line continue to hamper humanitarian organizations' ability to deliver aid and services to people impacted by the conflict, Sierra Leone urges parties to the conflict to allow unhindered access of humanitarian personnel to people in dire need. Madam President, the economic ramifications of the war have been keenly felt across the global landscape, particularly in the food and energy markets, trade dynamics, and supply chain disruptions. These disruptions have contributed to price hikes and supply shortages that have reverberated across sectors reliant on stable market prices. In view of the economic challenges, Sierra Leone emphasizes the importance of the resolution of the conflict to enable the recovery and stabilization of not only the region, but the wider world. By supporting efforts to stabilize energy markets, restore trade networks, and provide economic assistance to affected populations, we can mitigate the economic impact of the conflict and pave the way for sustainable economic growth and development in the region and beyond. Moreover, the conflict has strained global political and economic relations and heightened geopolitical tensions, with serious implications for international cooperation on critical socio-economic and development issues, in addition to the maintenance of international peace and security. The erosion of trust and cooperation between nations has also exacerbated critical global issues such as arms control, nuclear proliferation, cybersecurity, and trade agreements, posing additional challenges for the maintenance of international peace and security. As we navigate the complexities of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and its multidimensional global repercussions, Sierra Leone once more calls for good faith diplomatic efforts in pursuit of a peaceful resolution. Meaningful steps must be taken towards the immediate cessation of the hostilities and parties to the conflict to engage constructively, including on their legitimate concerns, to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. Let me close, Madam President, by noting that based on our unwavering principled view on the sacrosanct nature of the UN Charter, principles of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states, we once more reiterate our call for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Guyana. Secretary General, I thank you for your briefing and indeed for all you do in trying to forge peace in our world. I also wish to acknowledge the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, all other ministers and high-level officials joining this meeting. Tomorrow will mark exactly 2 years since Russian military forces invaded the territory of Ukraine in what was then termed a special military operation, an action that has cost the lives of over 10,000 civilians, injured many more, and displaced over 6 million Ukrainians. The toll on civilians in both Ukraine and Russia, including women, children, the elderly, and persons living with disabilities, is exceedingly high, with no immediate end in sight. Excellencies, Russia's invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago violated the most basic tenets of the United Nations Charter and the principles of respect for territorial integrity, sovereignty, and non-interference. Our countries have all felt the impact of this war to some degree, not only in terms of increased challenges to the rules-based order as we know it, anchored in the Charter and international law, but also in terms of disruptions in food and energy prices, logistics and supply chains, and worsening hunger in the most vulnerable regions of the globe, already struggling amidst COVID-19 recovery efforts. As a small developing state whose sovereignty and territorial integrity are protected by legal norms and instruments, Guyana deplores the threat or use of force in the conduct of international relations and condemns the military aggression that has been unleashed against the people of Ukraine. We reiterate our call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a return to diplomacy. War must never be the answer. Instead, dialogue and diplomacy are the only guarantees of achieving lasting peace. While we welcome and recognize the efforts of some UN member states to find a diplomatic solution, we encourage greater investments in this regard. We call on the parties to respect the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality, and to fully comply with their legal obligations, including under the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. It is regrettable that this Council, which has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, is still unable to find a meaningful solution to end the conflict and to minimize the full impact of the war on the erosion of international norms. We repeat our call for the complete withdrawal of Russian military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine and urge the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict. We also urge strengthening efforts at all levels by all concerned parties toward a peaceful resolution. Guyana stands ready to work with members of this Council, and in fact everyone, to bring the war in Ukraine to a peaceful end and to find a sustainable solution for long-lasting peace. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Dmytro Kuleba, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. As we discuss the war and peace talks and negotiations, here today there is another air raid on Ukraine taking place right now. And a residential building in Odessa was hit less than an hour ago. 2 civilians are heavily wounded, delivered to the hospital. And I'm afraid that someone is going to die in Ukraine before this meeting is adjourned. Because talking about negotiations is one thing, but throwing more drones and missiles on Ukraine, as Russia does every day, is completely another thing. But first of all, allow me to thank Secretary General for his attendance and his briefing, and also, of course, my thanks go to Guyanese presidency for convening us today. 2 years since Russia started its full-scale military invasion, 10 years since it started its aggression by attempting to annex Ukrainian Crimea and launching war in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Today, Russia's name is synonymous with aggression, war, crimes, and barbarism. Its ugly face is the direct result of its impunity, stemming first and foremost from its presence in this chamber's seat. This is the seat of the Soviet Union, a state that does not exist anymore, and it has never been legally transferred to the Russian Federation. This is an example of how a small fraud led to a global catastrophe. We continue to insist that Russia has no legal right to be present at this table, and the future reform should correct this historic mistake that led to deadly consequences. Putin's regime, which has been in place for around 24 years now, has already ruined millions of lives. During this time, Moscow launched or joined at least 3 major wars in Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria, which is approximately 1 war every 8 years. It also stands behind the attempted coup in Montenegro and destabilizing efforts in the Sahel region. And the scariest thing is that we must now focus not only on the lives already taken by Russia, but also on the lives that it is prepared to take in the future. Russia acted every time this Council failed to act. For every word uttered in this room, Russia took a real human life. And it's happening right now. It continues to happen. And it is only through our resolute and joint actions that we can put the aggressor in its place and restore international peace and security. We do believe in the United Nations and the UN Charter, and we do applaud the tireless efforts of the responsible members of this Council. Colleagues, Russian propaganda is now trumpeting what they call the liberation of Avdiivka. Well, what we see in Avdiivka right now is the liberation à la Russe. Russia fully liberated the city of its people, buildings, and life. It dropped hundreds of guided aerial bombs, each with a warhead weighing 250 or 500 kilograms. Hundreds of bombs, each is carrying 250 or 500 kilograms of explosive. Google and see a whole this bomb leaves when it hits the building, the house, hospital. The streets of Avdiivka are literally covered with the corpses of Russian soldiers killed in the so-called meat assaults. This is not how we call them. This is how they, the Russians themselves, call this barbaric war tactic. They sent their own people into meat assaults. Conquer at any cost. This is their strategy. Russia has paid for the ruins of Avdiivka with the lives of at least 17,000 Russian soldiers since October 2023. This is more casualties in a few months than in 10 years of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Immediately after occupying the city, the Russians committed new war crimes there. As confirmed by footage circulated by Russian propaganda itself, at least 5 Ukrainian prisoners of war, heavily wounded, were killed by the Russians. Justice must be served to all victims of Russian crimes, and we continue to work on holding Russia accountable. We categorically reject any Russian attempts to evade responsibility, including by spreading lies about the recent International Court of Justice ruling on January 31st. Our detailed letter outlining Ukraine's position was distributed in the Council a few days ago. There is no more important task for everyone present in this room than to realize that there are other cities outside Ukraine that can become Avdiivka if the Russian imperial conquest is not stopped. On the eve of the invasion 2 years ago, I warned that no nation would be able to sit out the crisis that was about to begin. And this is what happened. So please, to those who did not hear me 2 years ago, hear me today. Either we stop Russia in Ukraine now by expelling the invaders, or we will face a fire in other parts of the world that will claim millions of lives. And when future generations look back at this moment in time and read the records of our meetings, they will wonder why the world failed to act in such an obvious case of one country shattering the entire international peace and security. And they will ask us, why were they not able to stop it? We can restore peace if we act together in a resolute and principled manner. But instead of watching Moscow create problems and inviting others to solve them, which is the usual Russian strategy, we must push Russia back, because Russia itself is the problem, the global problem. Madam President, while we gather here, the situation on the front lines remains tense as Russia stops at nothing to bring more death and destruction to Ukraine. Russia still hopes for our divisions, perplexity, and indecisiveness, which would weaken international solidarity and military assistance to Ukraine. Intensifying missile terror against civilians and civilian infrastructure also serves Russia's purpose. Moscow hopes that the world will deplete its empathy towards Ukrainians if Ukrainians are killed every single day for too many days in a row. We shall not allow this to happen. We will rally the world behind our true cause even more. Russian terror only strengthens our resilience and commitment. Please remember that more support to Ukraine means more opportunities for peace. Just and lasting peace based on the UN Charter and peace formula proposed by Ukraine. Ukraine wants peace more than any other nation. However, we are not going to allow Russia to kill us freely on the road to peace. Nor will we ever accept any offer to surrender or to concede our lands and freedoms under the guise of peace. Not only because it will make futile the ultimate price we are paying now for 2 years in a row, but also because we will all be doomed to pay a much higher price in the future. And if you genuinely wish to lower this price and give peace a chance, send us air defense to protect our civilians and ammunition to stop Russian army on our soil. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Kuleba, for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Xavier Bettel, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, and Minister for Development, Cooperation and Humanitarian Affairs of Luxembourg.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Encore une fois, Monsieur Nebensia quitte la salle quand on prend la parole. C'est difficile d'avoir un dialogue. Alors c'est ce qu'il avait demandé ce matin. Nous sommes aujourd'hui ici et je permets juste de dire qu'il a dit qu'on était tous des fonctionnaires et des bureaucrates. J'ai été élu démocratiquement avec des partis d'opposition qui ont le droit de se présenter. Donc c'est juste aussi important de le rappeler pourquoi on est ici. Aussi 5 minutes pour expliquer pourquoi est-ce qu'on veut parler. Tout simplement parce qu'il est important ici dans cette salle de rappeler les valeurs pour lesquelles, après la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, on a dit qu'on voulait construire quelque chose ensemble. Et qu'aujourd'hui, la Russie se trouve si isolée. Et qu'aujourd'hui, à part la Syrie, l'Iran, la Corée du Nord et peut-être la Biélorussie sont les grands supports, je me poserai des questions si ce sont les alliés les plus sûrs pour parler de valeurs démocratiques telles que l'ambassadeur a voulu faire ce matin à l'Assemblée générale. La Russie est isolée. Quand on parle de nazis et qu'aujourd'hui l'Ukraine serait remplie de nazis et que la Russie serait presque en train de libérer l'Ukraine des nazis, c'est un affront par rapport aux Russes morts pendant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale qui se sont combattus contre les nazis. De les mettre tout simplement à ce niveau-là, de parler d'héros de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, oui. Mais parler aujourd'hui de vouloir libérer des nazis, je pense que le comportement et les comparaisons, c'est réécrire l'histoire. Permettez-moi juste d'insister aussi sur cette opération militaire spéciale. Comme on dit toujours, c'est une opération militaire spéciale. Oui, elle est spéciale parce qu'elle est injustifiée, elle est criminelle, elle est spéciale parce qu'une opération militaire, normalement, a des justifications. Et si elle ne l'est pas, c'est pour ça qu'il a qualifié peut-être de spéciale. Je dois juste vous dire qu'aujourd'hui, moi je fais partie d'une génération qui n'est pas connue la guerre. J'ai eu un voisin à l'époque qui était l'Allemagne. Aujourd'hui, c'est mon partenaire, c'est mon voisin, c'est mon ami, je construis les choses avec eux. Et que de nos jours, la sécurité des jeunes dépend du voisin. Et j'ai certains pays sur la table, quand je vois la République de Corée, qui doivent se poser des questions le matin, quand on se réveille, ce que va penser un dictateur dans le nord du pays, ce qu'il va entreprendre. Il est triste pour des générations aujourd'hui de savoir que selon là où on est né, la sécurité n'est pas la même pour les uns ou pour les autres. Je ne parle pas d'autres conflits qu'il y a aujourd'hui qui ne sont pas l'ordre du jour.
Security is not the same.
Other countries around the world, but we certainly have to think of the future of our young people. We haven't yet signed. Those who haven't signed the text on the protection of children in schools should do that, because if we put at risk future generations, they will hold it against us.
Merci de m'avoir donné cette possibilité de prendre la parole. C'est un sujet qui me tient à cœur, moi-même ayant des origines russes et polonaises, et c'est triste aujourd'hui que beaucoup de Russes ont honte de leur nationalité, alors qu'avant c'était un pays qui était fier. Et j'aimerais que la Russie reconnaisse simplement les erreurs qu'ils aient faites. Il n'est jamais trop tard pour reconnaître les erreurs. Et l'impunité aussi est quelque chose qui doit exister et qui doit aussi être la base de la règle internationale. En tout cas, de se retrouver dans cette salle ici avec les propos tenus et le fait d'avoir un ambassadeur qui quitte montre la volonté du dialogue de la Russie. On est dans une impasse, il faut qu'on prenne les mesures nécessaires.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Bettel for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Annalena Baerbock, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany.
Madam President, as a representative of Russia asked why we Europeans are here today, I will tell you. Throughout my entire life, I've been lucky to live in peace in Europe, like millions of my generation. The reason why we are here today is because you, Russia, broke that peace in Europe. You broke our European peace order on our common shared continent. You broke the peace for millions of Ukrainians, men, children, and women. Women like Anastasia, a young mother who has lost her lower leg when she stepped on a Russian mine. She wants to return to the front as soon as she can. Like Oksana, who's a surgeon, who decided to operate on her own father when he was injured in Bucha. Like Julia, a teenager girl who I met in Kiev after she could be freed from her hostage in Russia, pleading to me, don't give in to Putin. When I think about the ruthless war of aggression that Russia has waged in Ukraine for 2 years now, I think about Anastasia, Oksana, Julia, and the bravery and resilience of millions of Ukrainians who know that if they end the defense of their country, Ukraine ends. Because I see what the brutal reality of Russian occupation means to their people in the eastern Ukrainian territories, where thousands of children have been deported like Julia to Russia, and where women, men are brutally raped, arrested, tortured. And yet, we heard again, we want to negotiate. But Putin is making clear every day, every hour, as we have heard right now, that he does not want to negotiate peace. He wants to complete his conquest. He has said it over and over again. Russia, a permanent member of this Security Council, wants a sovereign state to give up its right to exist. Where would we end up if this principle will prevail? As also the Secretary General has put surprisingly. Which of us would be the next country to be invaded by a ruthless neighbor? Whose children would be next to be abducted? Whose sons to be shot? Whose daughters to be raped? If we were to give in, that would be the end of the Charter, our Charter. Therefore, we will not cease our support for Ukraine. That's why the German government has just signed a bilateral security agreement that offers Ukraine reliable, long-term support. We stand with Ukraine as long as it takes, with men and women like Anastasia, Oksana, Julia, men and women who are defending their peace, our freedom, and our Charter of the United Nations. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Baerbock, for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Radoslav Sikorski, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Poland.
Madam President, I associate myself with the words of Minister Kuleba of Ukraine and my colleagues from the European Union. But I am amazed at the tone and the content of the presentation by the Russian ambassador, and I thought I could be useful by correcting the record. Ambassador Nebendia has called Kiev the clients of the West. Actually, Kiev is fighting to be independent of anybody. He calls them a criminal Kiev regime. In fact, Ukraine has a democratically elected government. He calls them Nazis. Well, the president is Jewish, the defense minister is Muslim, and they have no political prisoners. He said that Ukraine was wallowing in corruption. Well, Alexei Navalny documented how honest and full of probity his own country is. He blamed the war on US neocolonialism. In fact, it is Russia that tried to exterminate Ukraine in the 19th century, again under the Bolsheviks, and it's the third attempt. He said that we are prisoners of Russophobia. Phobia means irrational fear. Yet we are being threatened almost every day by the former president of Russia and by Putin propagandists with nuclear annihilation. I put to you that it's not irrational. When Russia threatens us, we trust it. He said that we are denying Russia's security interests. Not true. We've only started rearming ourselves when Russia started invading her neighbors. He even said that Poland attacked Russia during World War II. What is he talking about? It's the Soviet Union that attacked Poland together with Nazi Germany on the 17th of September 1939. They even held a joint victory parade on the 22nd of September. He says that Russia has always only beaten back aggression. What were Russian troops doing at the gates of Warsaw in August 1920? They were on a topographical excursion? No, the truth is that for every time that Russia has been invaded, she has invaded 10 times. He says that this is a perfidious proxy war by the West. My advice is don't fall into the Western trap. Withdraw your troops to the international border and avoid this Western plot. He also says that there was an illegal coup in Ukraine, in Kiev in 2014. Well, I was there. There was no coup. President Yanukovych murdered 100 of his compatriots, and he was removed from office by a democratically elected Ukrainian parliament, including his own party, the Party of Regions. And finally, he is saying that we, the West, are somehow trying to persuade that Russia can never be beaten. Well, Russia didn't win the Crimean War, it didn't win the Russo-Japanese War, it didn't win World War I, it didn't win the Battle of Warsaw, it didn't win in Afghanistan, and it didn't win the Cold War. But there is good news. After each failure, there were reforms. Such demagoguery is unworthy of a member on a permanent basis of the Security Council. But what the ambassador has achieved is to remind us why we resisted Soviet domination and what Ukraine is resisting now. They failed to subjugate us then, they'll fail to subjugate Ukraine and us now. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Sikorski for his statement, and I will now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Gabrielis Landsbergis, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania.
Thank you, Madam President. I will speak on behalf of Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. Today and tomorrow, many will yet again call on Russia to end its brutal war against Ukraine. Many will say that Russia's unprovoked aggression goes against everything these United Nations stand for. Some will question the credibility of this Council to defend the rules-based international order. But however loud, however eloquent we are, our Protestant outrage will barely register in Moscow, and rockets will continue to rain down on Ukrainian homes, hospitals, and schools. Today we are facing choices that might well define the century, just as choices in the 1930s defined the previous century. Do we continue to appease the aggressor, who is patient and meticulous in his attempts to turn everything this organization holds dear into a mockery? Do we once again allow him to escape responsibility for his aggression? Do we continue to feed him with lives and land, misled by our fear of escalation and naive hopes that this time he will be fully satisfied? Today we come to this Council to address the entire international community with a very simple message. For all our sakes, wake up. If we fail, the rules-based order will crumble. Ukraine's sovereignty, Europe's security, as well as the success of the global efforts for human rights, accountability for food security, nuclear safety will all be in the hands of those who benefit from disruption and chaos. History reminds us of the terrible cost of the wrong choices. Hedging our bets earns us nothing but more war. Russia is being emboldened by our cautious response. We see it emboldened in Ukraine. We see it emboldened in Russia itself, eliminating any opposition in Russia, aiming to destroy any hope for a different Russia, normal, peaceful Russia. Equally, other revisionist powers across the world are already exploiting our indecisiveness. If not contained, this Kremlin-driven arc of instability will continue to expand, igniting more conflicts that we are not prepared to counter. Ukraine may seem far away, and the world's attention is divided, but it is imperative to realize that Russia's aggression against Ukraine ultimately impacts us all. This war must be won, and won decisively. It is not just Europe's war, it is a challenge to the international order, which, while imperfect, aims to ensure that law rather than military might determines our borders and sovereignty. The choices we make at these crossroads will define how we are remembered. We have the capacity to win, as Ukraine continues to make enormous sacrifices to stand against the ruthless aggressor. History reminds us of the cost of our past mistakes. We must also find a political will to come up with an adequate legal response to Russia's illegal war of territorial conquest. Russia's leadership must bear full responsibility for the aggression launched by Vladimir Putin, else impunity will continue. Madam President, I would like to remind all those here today that our three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, have been occupied, colonized, and exploited by the exactly same aggressor more than once. More than once. And that is why we know from bitter experience that whatever words are spoken, Whatever agreements are signed, this aggressor has no plans to stop until he is stopped. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Landsbergis for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Gordon Grlić Radman, Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of Croatia.
Many of us addressed this Council a year ago, calling on Russia to cease its illegal aggression against Ukraine. Yet we are meeting in this chamber again today. Regrettably, marking 2 years since the beginning of Russia's military aggression against Ukraine and 10 years since the illegal annexation of Crimea. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a blatant violation of international law and the UN Charter, affecting both regional and global security, including the pillars of nuclear safety and security. To date, countless lives have been needlessly lost in this war, including tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians killed. For this, there needs to be accountability, not only because accountability provides justice to the victims, but also because it helps prevent future atrocities. Yet instead of ending this senseless war, Russia is intensifying it. Russia's actions have put entire societies around the world at risk by exposing them to food insecurity and energy shortages. We urge Russia to respect ICJ's preliminary measures, cease all attacks, particularly those affecting civilians and causing damage to civilian infrastructure, and to comply with the resolutions of this chamber and with the values and principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Madam President, we reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, as we have seen the beginning of this aggression. Croatia provided and continues to provide aid to Ukraine with urgent and humanitarian assistance alone amounting to almost 60 million euros, and over 25,000 Ukrainians have found temporary protection in Croatia. Recognizing from our own experience the costs and threats coming from mine contamination, Croatia hosted in Zagreb the first ever high-level international donors conference on humanitarian demining in Ukraine in October 2023. This conference, co-organized by the governments of Croatia and Ukraine, confirmed support to Ukraine's demining efforts by 34 participating countries, pledging €500 million overall. Finally, Madam President, we call on Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, cease its illegal procurement of arms and ammunition, and uphold its responsibilities as a member of this organization as well as a permanent member of this Council. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Grlić Radman for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Hanke Bruins-Slot, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm here today on behalf of the Group of Friends of Accountability following the aggression against Ukraine, a group of 49 member states and the European Union. We share a strong conviction. We don't accept that might makes right. And so it is with heavy hearts that we continue to witness Russia's unwarranted, unprovoked, and illegal war in Ukraine. Time again, the UN member states have underlined the need for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. Yet Russia has turned a deaf ear to these pleas. As firm believers in right over might, we cannot look away. We must do our utmost to hold Russia and those responsible to account for crimes committed in and against Ukraine. We commend the efforts and initiatives already taken so far, such as the ongoing work of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission, the Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council, and, as Her SG's Patents team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence. We also continue to support the Ukrainian Prosecutor General, the work carried out by the International Criminal Court, the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression, and the Register of Damage for Ukraine. Because we are all working towards one goal, ensuring accountability for the most serious crimes committed on Ukrainian territory and against the Ukrainian people. Madam President, Russia's act of aggression violates the UN Charter. As parties to this Charter, there's only one way we can respond. This cannot stand. Therefore, we reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to comply with its international obligations. We will never stop calling for this. We will keep demanding Russia withdraw all of its forces and respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its international recognized borders. We will never stop supporting the people of Ukraine. Thank you, Madam President.
Her Excellency, Ms. Bruin-Slot, for her statement. And I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Helena Carreiras, Minister of National Defense of Portugal.
Thank you, Madam President. I welcome the opportunity to address the Security Council on the situation in Ukraine. As Russia's illegal and unprovoked full-scale invasion enters its third year, and as the Ukrainian territories of Crimea and the Donbass reach a full decade under Russian illegal occupation, we cannot and will not fail to reiterate our resolute condemnation of these blatant violations of international law. This war not only jeopardizes the foundations of international security, it has also sent shockwaves around the world, disrupting global food and energy markets and affecting particularly the most vulnerable countries. Ukraine can continue to count on Portugal's full and unwavering support, both bilaterally and collectively within every multilateral framework, including here at the United Nations. From day one, we have been unequivocal about where we stand, side by side with Ukraine. The value of our commitments can only be measured by the consistency of our actions. In addition to our political support, Portugal has provided military support and humanitarian aid. In all these efforts, we have consistently responded to the calls of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian armed forces, bearing in mind our shared commitment towards restoring peace and security in Europe. And it is not only the government, but also the citizens of Portugal that strongly support this effort, even though we are geographically so far away. Ultimately, the goal is one and the same: to defend and uphold the rules, principles, and values that are enshrined in the United Nations Charter. This only can happen with a just and sustainable solution that is in accordance with the Charter and with Ukraine's peace formula, and that holds accountable those responsible for the ongoing atrocities. We therefore call on Russia to cease all operations, retreat from Ukraine, and respect international law. Together, united, we will prevail in supporting Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Carreiras for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Bujar Osmani, Minister for Foreign Affairs of North Macedonia.
Thank you so much, Madam President, Excellencies. I thank the UN Secretary General for his briefing on Ukraine. Tomorrow will mark 2 years since the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a blatant violation of the Charter of the United Nations and international law. North Macedonia strongly condemned and further condemns and renounces the decision of Moscow to opt the path of war, a clear act of aggression against an independent country. And we urge Russia once again to end this senseless war and withdraw its troops from the sovereign territory of Ukraine. This is the only way to restore peace and to create the conditions to further diplomatic engagement for a just and sustainable solution in line with the international law and the full respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We recall the adoption of last year's important UNGA resolution, and my country joined the other 140 member states in a common endeavor to restore peace, to safeguard the rule-based international order, as well as to reaffirm our firm and unequivocal support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders as of 1991. We deplore the Russian Federation's failure to observe it. Madam President, during these 2 years, the people of Ukraine have shown resilience and extraordinary courage in their fight for their freedom, independence, mere existence, and are just simply defending themselves, all of which are in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter. And every day we continue to hear reports of more civilian deaths, destruction and suffering, especially in the communities near the active conflict zone in eastern and southern Ukraine, and call for an end and on all attacks on critical infrastructures, including schools, hospitals, energy, water and sanitation systems. Justice and accountability must prevail. And accountability is not an objective per se, it is an indispensable tool to secure peace, stability and security, and the most effective instrument to avoid this happening again to another sovereign state, to another nation. We reiterate the importance of investigating the war crimes on the territory of Ukraine in order to bring the perpetrators to justice and other crimes, including the crime of aggression, in accordance with international law, in particular the International Criminal Court, and support the creation of a special tribunal regarding the crime of aggression against Ukraine. And North Macedonia will continue to engage in the work of the core group on options for the establishment of a tribunal on the crime of aggression against Ukraine. In these difficult times, North Macedonia will continue to stand by Ukraine and its people, hopeful that reason will prevail and that life will be back to normal soon. Restoring peace should be an imperative. We remain fully engaged in providing support to these efforts and firmly believe that multilateralism should overcome militarism. I thank you so much.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Osmani, for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.